ITS 2010 Understanding Internet Technology. We're starting a new module today. This is Unit 1 of Module 3. This is the module that turns to our primary reading book for the class, which is The Inevitable by Kevin Kelly. To put a little skin, put a little context on the technology, give us both some context for what we can do with the technology and perhaps a little perspective on the internet business. Author is Kevin Kelly, co-founding editor of a paper magazine called Wired, now of course Wired.com, a San Francisco, Silicon Valley-based publication that is pretty much right there. So it's kind of a business book. It's kind of a values and principles kind of book, and it's got some interesting takes on what the future may bring. So in prior years, as a supplement to the seriously technical book, we've used Tubes by Andrew Bloom and Industries of the Future by Alec Ross, realizing that we can both cover all the technology that we need to, and that we can be humane about it, we can be purposeful about it, we can perhaps satisfy my students, satisfy your need for things to be relevant. So the way we're going to pursue this, given 12 chapters and 6 modules, is we'll do 2 chapters pretty much per recording for each one of the units. This gives us a couple slides really to develop my perspective on the book, my interpretation on the book. Generally, I do that with a pretty light hand, although, I'll have an exception here and there. The way the book is expressed is verbs. Well, technically it's the noun or gerund form of the verb, but the chapters have titles like becoming, cognifying, flowing, screening, accessing, sharing, filtering, remixing, interacting, tracking, questioning, and then back to the beginning. So we have those kind of vague concepts. All I can say is, read them in order. They're kind of cumulative. The only way not to read it is not to read it. The only way to read it wrong is to kind of take things out of order. Your deliverable for me is to choose one of these 12 topics and make it the basis for your brief writing assignment, essay number 2. But it also really does support our critical thinking objective of the class, which to be borne out not so much through quizzes, but through these reading assignments where you're going to come up with some idea, concept, application on your own based on what you're learning, and then 4, kind of make sure that you can express back to me this, what I call the notion of duality. Duality is kind of different for us in this book. Duality is dream big dreams and don't worry so much about how we're going to get the work done. So the duality part, to date has been the way it works is not exactly the way it's been developed internally. It's probably better than the way it was done internally. The internal stuff is compromised and obsolete in a lot of cases. So this will help with your writing assignments. This will help with your thinking. And the outcomes to this in the entire class and hopefully the entire communications completion degree, if you're in that program, is to become a thoughtful thinker. It's open-ended. In most of this class, I believe 80% of the students in this section of this class are within my home college, which is communications. So I'll speak to you, if that's you. I'm speaking to you anyway. That the communicators kind of bridge the technology into the marketplace. A lot of the perception of value is motivated, derived, and communicated by people who are non-technical. And non-technical is not an insult. That it's a lot of people have technical educations and function in functional roles, and that is great stuff. So, dualities is a rule, but we realize as we go through these 12 high concepts that some of these things are going to develop as a response to a felt need, as opposed to some little prototype that might be running already. So I call that being developed from the outside in, from requirements and needs from people, from markets. We'll point out as I wrap up slide number 1, Mr. Kelly is kind of a techno optimist, that his world has a lot of technology in it. The technology doesn't create any new problems. In fact, his version of the technology improves his quality of life. That is one point of view among many. I think reality is somewhere in the middle, someplace. And final point on this slide, look, you don't have to agree with me. On matters of fact, you don't get to choose your facts, but as you predict the future, of course, how could you be wrong when you're writing about it today? But you don't have to be compelled to agree with Mr. Kelly. You don't really have to feel compelled to agree with me. You have to kind of stick with facts. And because we are word people, that obviously, when we refer to the work of other people, we give them credit for it. We must know when we are citing other sources. This is not a plagiarism talk. It's merely the fact that a lot of ideas belong to other people, and we should associate them properly. And you don't have to agree with me. You have to get your facts straight and draw your own conclusions, because in life you're going to have to live with them, folks. Slide number 2, chapter 1 is called Becoming. And, these chapter titles are very interesting. It's wise to ponder and reflect them. Sometimes you got to read a couple pages into the chapter before that makes sense why we've summoned that name out of the all possible names. And I think the meaning of chapter 1 in our search for meaning is that this environment of internet technology, of connectivity and of applications, of devices, and interfaces that are emerging does not sit still. It happens to be that, we remedially upgrade our systems. My Windows computer is upgraded substantially following the second Tuesday of every month. Every time I sit down to it, I run my Windows updates. And there is just not just a need to fix bugs, but we have a taste for novelty. We're restless in our discontent with our devices. We are eager, at least to try out, if not adopt the next new thing. That's not an age thing. There are people my age that are eager to innovate. There are people that are much younger that are happy, with Facebook, just kind of the way it is. But this user or consumer discontent is very real. And, part of the whole magic of the internet is there are new things constantly. And, there's a couple ways of kind of portraying this. I believe it is, I Googled it. It's Voltaire's statement that the best is the enemy of the good. Kind of the engineer's version as well. The better is the enemy of good enough. Kind of the former is kind of maximizing, and the latter is somewhat to kind of minimizing the incremental kind of improvement to things. Why else would people buy, the latest Samsung Galaxy or Windows Phone? Because they're better than the last thing. Joseph Schumpeter is a relatively modern, presumably German economist, who termed this creative destruction, and that we don't see a lot of that. It's not like some new food is going to make all prior foods obsolete. It's not like some mode of transportation is going to emerge out of nowhere and immediately kind of displace all the prior modes. But in this kind of software-defined environment where we have a full palette and a fresh canvas to create new things in software, yes, the new things render the current environment obsolete on a regular basis. Go see what the garage sale or eBay price is on something that's kind of non-artistic and a little bit old, such as a glass monitor, such as those kind of fruity colored, glass Macintoshes. That history is unkind to old technology. So creative disruption, which I mispronounced as creative destruction, is a concept that will permeate the Kevin Kelly book. So the process of this becoming is a process. He concludes actually by saying, maybe the first best time was 2006. The second best time is like now. If you have some idea to go do something, to start up a company, to create a new product or service, now certainly is his admonition, and I would certainly agree with that. He also points out that, hindsight is pretty cruel, that there are things now that we might even observe, we don't embrace, we don't adopt, and then in 2 years there'll be billion-dollar stock offerings. We'll make somebody fabulously wealthy over something that we look askance at and do not adopt. In 2 or 10 or 20 years from now, they may be huge. I mean, I sold my Apple stock after the initial public offering. I think I kept it like a year or two. Then I needed to go to graduate school and needed money. Should have kept it. Point number 4, there are people that are like against this. You or I at times are that person where we look at this and say, there's no value in this. There's no way people would spend money for this. And maybe it's bad for us, and we are that person, and we certainly know these people. He cites a couple in there, the couple corporations like McDonald's that did not see enough of the future of the internet to reserve the name of the company as a domain name. Cliff Stoll, I met Cliff Stoll, brilliant PhD physicist from Berkeley, worked at some nuclear lab for the U.S. government. His class of book is called The Cuckoo's Egg. I'm going to give you lots of book references, and I in fact will quietly bribe you with additional points in this class if you read one of these books that I cite or something else that you suggest. Cuckoo's Egg was a kind of a cybercrime history, is his encounter on the job of people stealing milliseconds of compute time, turned into a transnational East-West conflict of stolen defense secrets. But that's not nearly as important as his book called Silicon Snake Oil. Snake oil meaning one of these fake patent medicine sorts of things that would be sold at an unreasonable price to provide healing or health, and of course was nothing. And he would equate Silicon Valley's constant hyping of new products and stuff as snake oil. And so it's a conversation. It is a rational discussion to take place. Perhaps let somebody else have their name stuck on it rather than you, because hard to predict the future is slide number 3. A brief history. NIB, I'll just slip in here, is not in book. It's an aside I will slip in because I can. The internet was created in theory on paper simultaneously in the US and the UK in kind of like the early 1960s as a defense contract to both invent the concepts, all of which came true, and the technology, most of which came true, through the U.S. Department of Defense Advanced Research Projects Administration, ARPA net, sometimes called DARPA for the Defense ARPA, because other agencies now do ARPA. But the thought was, on the one hand, a network that did not have a single point of failure would be resilient against attacks by known enemies in their intercontinental ballistic missiles. It could also have meant that the computing paradigm of the 60s had these great big refrigerator-sized computers and these great big terminal devices on a one-for-one basis, and Mr. Bob Kahn wanted one device, not to rule them all, but one kind of terminal device that he could use to attach to 3 different computer mainframe systems. He wanted his conference room back. That's the story, and when wizards stay up late. So defense, resilience, continuity of government, combining terminal devices into a single computer, and the selfishness of finally getting a conference room of your own and then having to fill it full of equipment. Well, that defense model then shifted to the National Science Foundation, which is, science, engineering, it's higher education, and a handful of private laboratories, including Battelle and Columbus, part of the NSF ecosystem. They were the custodian of the internet for a little while in the 90s, in a transitional time before basically they admitted that the commercial uses were a lot more interesting than the educational uses of the internet. This is in the days of text-only screens, so that was a pretty big observation on their part. And so the ARPANET transitioned from defense to NSF to the companies that provided it. Simultaneously, the defense folks did not stay on it at all. They built their own called Nipper and Sipper nets, the secure and non-secure internet protocol-based networks. So they proved that it worked well enough, and so they built two of their own, and then kicked the other internet over to the NSF, and then the NSF kind of conceded that companies like AT&T and what has turned into Verizon were kind of better off running it in the first place. The book relates a evolution of the internet from text, which was used for, email and something that kind of looked like newsreaders that had limited ability to access and to search. And while just kind of growing out of the text phase to the graphics phase as we went from DOS to Windows, search using hyperlinks and hypertext linking emerged pretty much simultaneously. So depending on when you got into this field, your notion of this might be email, or it might be search if you showed up a few years later, or it might be the web on glass monitors, okay, if that's when you arrived. Or if you arrived, a few years after that, we have the world's biggest bookstore, retailer, and shopping, and then somewhere in the midst of that, the mighty search engines of Google and Yahoo and others, simultaneously emerged at that same time. And if you showed up a little bit after that, then, you understood that user-generated websites, kind of personal websites and amateur websites, and every organization had a website, followed by kind of the incremental emergence of video. And YouTube, of course, is, to the best of my knowledge, it's substantially user-generated video content. So there. And so the final prediction on slide number 3 from Mr. Kelly was that, the next phase of this, and I'm not even going to bother to count these epochs or eras or phases, would be that there'd be some intelligence that's running inside the network that is inside everything. It's inside our telephones, inside our toasters, inside our thermostats. I'm running out of T's. It would be pervasive. It would be always on. It would be ubiquitous, which is a great word. It would be fairly low level, and that this intelligence would be present in even, the $10 devices. And this notion of intelligence we have not yet defined. That's really the point of chapter 2 and slide number 4. See how fast that is? For slide number 2, I'm sure he pondered, how can I make this about intelligence and find a verb to fit this? Well, cognition is the act of the mind, and so cognifying, I don't know, I think he's trying to imbue the devices with cognition, not so much the people. And the nature of the book takes us from what we're going to get into as intelligence, into robotics, and I will say very little about robotics. That's just not all that relevant in classes of limited duration, modules, units, and lectures. So, looking at this, the cognition intelligence does kind of beg the question of, what does it mean to be human? Who am I? Why am I here? The meaning of life, all the easy questions like that, which I'm going to defer to you and your spiritual leader. But there's some like really profound observations in this chapter, and then some really challenging predictions in that, we do talk about, no sooner do we say that a device presents intelligence or demonstrates intelligence than we kind of no longer call it AI. So, this is intelligence of the non-human, of the artificial nature. And so, question is, originally was AI going to be some windowless, great big windowless building with a lot of computers and a lot of storage in it that had access to all the digital information since the beginning, and then some metaphorical, metaphysical kind of algorithms that could discern the right answers and that could create new knowledge. No, in fact, it is similarly not going to be that any single sort of thing. By the way, the HAL 9000 in 2001: A Space Odyssey, doesn't matter how many times I watch it, I still don't understand it. I just kind of like the music, apparently. But the HAL 9000 is that single metaphysical box that all by itself, disconnected from anything else, has all the answers. And I'm sorry, Dave, I can't help you. Rather, the AI, as expressed in this book and is really customarily understood in the field, is a bunch of knowledge and a bunch of algorithms and a bunch of computation that is distributed all over everywhere, probably at various different vendors, including the banks, the insurance companies, the government, the Fortune 500. Each of them has a piece of the puzzle in our complicated lives that encounter so many institutions and systems. Thrives across a network of sources. Now, algorithm is a word that I am frequently going to invoke and occasionally give some examples of. But, an algorithm is a series of steps that leads to a conclusion. It begins at the beginning, goes to the end, then stops. Or it might repeat. Computers don't have intellect, will, and emotion. Computers have instructions. They have stored programs in them. They have some electronics that can perform, and these electronics have some interface to the outside world, either through keyboards or monitors or mice or network interfaces. That's what computers are, and algorithms are really just the series of steps that the computer executes. So our our approach to algorithms in here, AI 2019, not overly sophisticated. I even describe it as primitive. That, and then we're in this awkward marketing position that once something really has shown its value, we no longer hype it as AI. We probably call it something else and raise its price. So AI, this is not the most solid category for us to describe things. It's a category that attracts attention, but I'm not the one to speak for the market. But we will kind of separate the AI algorithm space between those things that are human-facing, because language is just so complicated. Language is completely driven by context. And I consider it a grand challenge. I realize that we have Amazon Alexa, we have Siri, we have Cortana, we have very interesting voice interfaces. They're not nearly as flexible as and then I develop in this space, so I work intimately with the Amazon version of this. I wouldn't call its characteristics intelligence. I would call it more scripted. That it will understand, it will recognize words in a sentence. It will recognize the phonemes and turn those phonemes into words, but it cannot, with all the degrees of freedom necessary to communicate in language, be able to interpret anything out of context, which is exactly what humans do. And then there's the back end that has to do with inference that can be data-driven. It happens that, by the way, humans by themselves are not like terribly good with data, especially if that analysis involves math. Even the PhD statisticians do not intuitively do math well, and so we're good at a very small portfolio of steps, and then we tend to be like pretty awful with most of the rest of those things. And we say we put this in the cloud. By cloud, we speak specifically of Amazon, which is a cloud service provider. Google is a cloud service provider. Microsoft, IBM, Oracle. These names will come up throughout the book because this is a business book. On to slide number 5. Sure, we have some use cases in here. The one on the bottom of the list is robots and automation. And, okay, well, I brought it up first. We've had automation ever since we replaced, falling water with steam in factories. So we've used motors and hydraulics to make repetitive processes easier and to leverage the strength of people with the ultimate strength of machines. And then, our manufacturing capability often runs into the millions of pieces. And so there's a lot of automation in a lot of things, and it just kind of gets better every day or so, to the extent that, the world is a global place. Manufacturing may take place in a low-wage country with no environmental protection, while the design is taking place in some place, with Chick-fil-A, someplace that's, urban, suburban. And the data resides in a third venue, that being a cloud service provider that is equally reachable by the designers and the manufacturers. And it's in some place that's got, reasonable compute and no earthquakes or hurricanes. So to go through the use case things, he brings up playing chess. He brings up self-driving vehicles. He brings up medical diagnosis. And I believe you brought up loan approval, or I read that someplace else. And we recognize that none of these is optimized. None of these is best when it's purely human or purely machine. It is some augmentation of the human situational awareness with the depth of knowledge, if you will, the depth of the experiences embodied in the data sets of the machines. So, the best chess player has got an automated helper. The self-driving vehicles, the state-of-the-art of self-driving vehicles is there's still a driver with the hands on the wheel. Okay, and so we actually don't know how to hand off the control from the vehicle back to the driver when we need the driver. So it's like having a truck, drive down the highway across the width of the Ohio Turnpike. It's not complicated stuff, but having the driver intercede when there's an extreme event or an unexpected event, it is that transition that has not actually been solved. And because it hasn't, then none of the other stuff can pass go. Yeah, we have a great system for having vehicles follow each other in close order. They're called trains. Okay. The medical diagnosis story is somewhat interesting. It's a Cleveland story with Exploris, now called IBM Watson Health, that I believe in some range of oncology or pathology. I'm not an expert. That the automation does as well as the doctor, but they kind of left out the part that the doctor doesn't do all that well. And so for the automation to be able to perhaps read slides and to go through the literature in the medical journals, basically matches the performance of the docs at the Cleveland Clinic. It's unfortunate, though, that the doc's record isn't overly exemplary. There's this thing called machine learning, which is pattern matching. It happens that we train it against data. When you put a Google search, when you enter a keyword search term into your Google search box and then select something, then you've helped make Google a little bit better on the search side. You're kind of training it, not the other way around. The pattern matching is an exercise. We train it and it gets better. It cannot explain what it just did. It just kind of can recognize patterns, whether they are in fact image patterns like facial recognition or numerical data free of context or rich with context, or what have you. That it reinforces all current reasoning, which then again kind of propagates any bias and prejudice. And so we got to be careful where we aim that thing. And following, to wrap up on this thing, there's a decided gap between what we possess as humans as general intelligence, which has not been solved, and then what Kelly refers to as cheap smartness. So it's like for my garage door to like not lower itself if there's like a dog there or a human or anything blocking the beams is intelligence, and it's artificial. But I don't think I could get a patent, let alone a Nobel Prize for that. Now, just to wrap up with a couple things kind of beyond the book, because I did a master's degree in artificial intelligence when compute was scarce, there was a consensus at that time that a novice, an apprentice, might employ hundreds of rules of the nature of the syntax if-then in order to really discern and diagnose the situation and then act accordingly, whether it's make a statement or to take an action accordingly with this interpretation of the evidence at hand. And a master would have thousands of rules. And so somewhere between the pre-med major and the fellow in the American Academy of Surgery, if there is such a thing, is an order of magnitude or so of the number of rules that describe the different situations that in that case gained through experience. And actually the last thing, Kahneman, Tversky, Nobel Prize winners on behavioral economics, and then kind of the public version of that is Michael somebody's book called The Undoing Project. Fascinating walk into how the mind works. On to slide 6. I know we're running a little long. It may well be that module 3 runs long. We didn't discuss hardware. Hardware is not an issue going forward in the evolution of the internet. It's a commodity. It's something that has a declining unit cost, which is problematic for people who want to get a bigger boat every couple of years selling computer hardware. It's not looking good for them. There's a seminal article in an authoritative publication called Software is Eating the World. Subset of that is Software is Eating the Hardware. This is a software concern. Applications, operating systems, the cloud. Other than the user interface that's on our phones, the data and the logic are like someplace else. They're in the cloud. They're in some, 250,000 square foot air-conditioned, windowless building, somewhere outside the outer belt in one of our big cities. And the heavy lifting is done in the cloud through programs running on the cloud, going through the user interface on the phone or the Echo Dot or whatever our human-facing interface is. It means the network is very important for those of us in the network infrastructure business. These devices, without being connected to the internet, are bricks. And so the network connectivity part is a lot more important than it was 10 years ago. So try to wrap up this in a reasonable amount of time. Ready Player One, more interesting book than the movie is, but my sense is that the diss in Ready Player One was all this stuff is 80s trivia. Fine. Okay, fine. Tech history is not relevant, and so it's a whole lot more like 80s trivia. It's trivia. If you know it, you can maybe find a new word in Scrabble, or you can answer some Jeopardy questions, or whatever people do with their free time. Mr. Carlos Santillana said those who don't know history are condemned to repeat it. That is so not true for tech. I mean, there aren't a lot of good lessons in tech other than when opportunity presents itself, take it. And to wrap up, finally, there's deduction and there's induction. Deduction takes us from the general to the specific. I'm a very deductive teacher in some of my classes, and I'm treating you as adult learners, thoughtful thinkers, and perhaps creators of new companies and new knowledge. So we're going the inductive route here, okay? Duality says how this stuff gets done and when it gets done on is a constraint. Don't worry about that. Duality says, think great thoughts, invent new products, do not be constrained by technology, engineering, or even the laws of physics. Although I cannot get a waiver on the laws of physics. Think about what is the next thing. My youngest exited the house. He went on to move on to go to school someplace else. And I just to see the world through her eyes meant that the world, even like Vine is obsolete and TikTok is like the latest interesting app until it'll be something else designed to give teens privacy away from their parents. Good luck, parents and future parents. And so at this point, we have like infinite compute, we have infinite storage, we have infinite networking. What would you do with all that? We have magical devices that fit in our pockets, especially if we buy clothes whose pockets are shaped like our phones. If we're going to have gigabit wireless that's everywhere, we can have as many compute cycles, and we can reach probably any data factoid anywhere to do anything. So what do you want to do with that? That is your challenge, not so much mine. That's paper 3, by the way. And then finally, if you feel a sense of social responsibility or public service, then, what are kind of the guardrails that we would put around becoming and cognifying? Thank you for listening. We'll go on to our next immediately. It's Module 3, Unit 2 of ITS 2010. Today, discussion focuses on Chapters 3 and 4 out of the Kevin Kelly book, and a little bit more, maybe a lot more. The chapters are flowing and screening. We build upon our prior discussion, which kind of looked at the becoming of new products and the cognifying, meaning kind of the pervasive low-level logic and intelligence that goes into, these and all future kind of products. Flowing is going to take us into some business principles. No apologies for that. And screening will not surprise you, although part of it might, just a little bit might. So let me begin this by sharing maybe a little bit more of a personal, professional kind of note. Again, trying to convince you perhaps that in a technology class, this stuff matters. I've been through new company startups and new product startups. It's actually a lot of fun. I would recommend it. Some people, want to accumulate power in a corporate setting. Other people have other kind of opportunities. I came out of tech and ended up in some interesting cases. And it was never a solo effort. Naturally, you can expect I would have been on the tech team. And you're right. And what I found in all these cases, that the more important, more rare, essential ingredient to the success of the product in the company came from the marketing type organization, from the marketing sales organization, not the product and fulfillment organization. Some of this involved hardware, and so the hardware activity required people actually to, make these things, on a delivery schedule, and they'd have to be right. So I don't want to overlook that. That's an important part of the story that I'm not going to get into. But the marketing folks understood either the existing need or the ability to create a need for this product. They would understand the niche. They would be able to size the opportunity and plan the steps that would be needed to be a leader in that opportunity space. And these are communicators, which is the point. They're folks that maybe we don't have classes in it, but they were very perceptive and very understanding. And then they did the messaging, and they actually did more of the product design, I think, from the outside in than the product developers did. And that is a huge statement to make. The software business relies on intellectual property. It is a property right. It is the equity. It is the basis for wealth. It is owned, and it is not sold. It is licensed. This is the other IP. We'll talk about TCP IP for Internet Protocol. This kind of IP is the intellectual property, and it is the basis for which, companies are formed. It is generally proprietary, although in a later chapter we'll talk about these kind of communal approaches to intellectual property. And so, finally, to roll off slide number 1, it's okay to start with a prototype, a pre-production prototype, preferably a working prototype, and shop that around, both to convince yourselves that this thing works and perhaps to attract investment. It is no sin for those who create new products and new systems to have an exit strategy, which might be to take a company public or to sell a company or that product to somebody else. As I look at my resume, which I try to keep as brief as possible, I've noticed that other than like the university, the identity of my employers has changed over time because the companies bought and then bought again, or it failed, and the entrails are part of yet some other kind of organization. Other than the university that's like 200 years old. Slide number 2, flowing. Except there's more to it than just flowing. The background stuff is better than the flowing part. So let's do the backgroundish stuff. Sharing is its own chapter. We'll catch that on Unit 3. But the notion of sharing is at the heart of my department, the Information and Telecommunication Systems activity within the School of Emerging Communication Technologies. ITS principle number 1 is that, traffic is bursty. Traffic is non-uniform. Technically, your professor would say traffic is probabilistic. So the demand or the usage is probabilistic. It has an average. Of course, everything has an average. That's a math feature. But it has a burst. It peaks. Phone calls peak at 10 in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, period. We know that. Netflix usage peaks probably at 10 o'clock at night. Text usage peaks at travel times. We just know those things, and we know those things without bias. Our advantage competitively might be that we know customer demand in better than anybody else can. And it happens that often we can describe these things by a probability distribution, like the bell curve, that we can characterize by its shape, its symmetry, its mean, its standard deviation. It's important for us to be good at that. And that's true in any consumer-facing, user-facing enterprise, retail, banking, e-commerce, all the above. Talk a little bit now about the gig economy. The gig economy is like drive for Uber, drive for Lyft, rent your place out versus, Airbnb or whatever. We are sensitive not only where the peak of the curve is, but what is the area underneath the curve or the bell curve? Because, there's an attribute called utilization. For a lot of people, if you drive 12,000 miles a year on an average of 30 miles an hour, your car's only use 400 hours a year. That's out of like 10,000. That's like 4% utilization and 96% waste. Well, you can do that math as well as I can. And so what if, I could make a couple bucks by using my car a little more? What if I could, while I'm gone, rent my house out or something? So the gig economy is mathematically sound. I'm not sure that it's a good place to invest in. I'm not sure it's a good place to work for. That's beyond my area of expertise, but it's there. That gig is like it's a gig, like it's a music gig. It's not short for gigabit or giga as the prefix of 10 to the 9th. Mr. Kelly then points out 3 digital ages, which I thought was pretty interesting. I mean, there's a lot of ways to do it, and they're probably all right. His says, we go from, using computation, using automation just to substitute one for one with something that was already there. Fine. Then he said, then there's kind of this phase that we did everything through a portal, through a gateway, that was rigid. In fact, the words had meaning. There was taxonomy and ontology. There's control. There's somebody there to make you pay for the use of this. It was internally organized. And then he said the third phase, and this is where he gets into the flows a little bit, is there's no organization at all. It's externally organized if you choose to use it, but this is not you walking up to a portal. This is a stream of tweets. This is a stream of Facebook updates. This is a stream of financial information. It is a tree-shaped structure for propagating information, perhaps to subscribers. It is social media. It is channels on YouTube. Period. End of story. And instead of having a structure and a taxonomy and an ontology and a hierarchy and a graduate degree, it's just a bunch of tags. And if you type the tag right, you're in. If you type the tag wrong, you've missed it. And if you didn't follow the tag at all, then it's not even going to get an echo. Column number 2, we'll speak about the value proposition because, other than what we do for education and these nonprofit public good kind of sectors, this telecom application space is capitalistic. Okay? And as Voltaire would have said, best is the enemy of the good. Hogue would say better is the enemy of good enough. The user's perception of value just has flipped. That this statement from Kelly was, we used to want like the uniform quality of McDonald's. Let me repeat that in case you missed that. We'd like to be able to stop anywhere along any interstate and get a high quality product that's just like every other McDonald's or Wendy's or Tim Hortons or Dunkin' Donuts or what have you. It's uniform, and in fact it might even, because there's such close competitors, have to compete on price. And they said, well, now, in this world, because we have made everything equally accessible through the web, let's see if we can find uniqueness to transcend sameness to a value proposition that would get people to pay more for things like the immediacy of the data, the personalization of the data, some interpretation in a format that's amenable to you, something that is sourced and more authentic, the book has the entire list. Accessibility, embodiment in another more physical form perhaps. Patronage, association can go with this at a more personal level. And discoverability, would we pay more for these things if they become somehow more personal and more exclusive? So he says. And more relevant to us as we close this slide, that is professionals, as emerging professionals, as practicing professionals, that these skills of just distributing are not nearly as valuable as, from a medium step, meaning perhaps curation, but to use this information to influence. And I'll just let that stand. I don't think I can really embellish that anymore. But, we used to, we try to wring all the cost out of distribution to make distribution frictionless and easy, to make something universally accessible. And it was unfocused. And the unit cost declined year over year for these sorts of things. Hard to preserve value, especially when we were competing against free sources. And now, the echo to that is a different value proposition that's personal and timely and curated by somebody who specifically wants to influence your decisions, perhaps even your decision to purchase. Hard to believe. Slide number 3. I'm really not much of a music person, so, I'll just point out that people do Pandora and Spotify and SoundCloud. I don't. I do podcasts, but I think that the argument extends to podcasts just as easily because there's a lot of value locked into what he called the fixity. He had to invent the word fixity so he could get to the word fluidity, where fluidity was, a proposition that said there's a market with high margin or full margin. If we could kind of break apart these bundles. I mean, the bundle is kind of, it was, I would demean it by saying it's a very 90s concept. And, maybe that whatever decade or century this is, and it's like, we want to unlock the value through this fluidity of the availability of the content. Okay, you don't have to buy the whole album, which was like 2 songs you wanted and 10 you didn't, to the fluidity of tracks where you could pay more. They could get more customers to pay the $1, $2 for the tracks that they wanted. Unlocks the bundle. A little bit of a riff. The book called The Long Tail by Chris Anderson is substantially about Amazon, and the beauty of Amazon is not the stuff in the warehouses that they sell, that they own or they consign. It's the stuff that they don't own and they don't consign. They just go through the marketplace. Half the value of the Amazon retail machine is the obscure stuff that sells in low volume at full price. And so, again, is it all in the presentation? Not entirely, but it is the unique Amazon value add. And hopefully of the 30 people registered for this class, some of you will like that. If you do, if this kind of reasoning, matters to you, just send me a note. Also adds on to this recommender feature, which really does good for low volume, kind of boutique-y kind of situations. Their storefront is Amazon. Doesn't mean it's cheap. So Kelly will identify, wrapping up slide 3, he'll invoke the ghost of Schumpeter again. But he said, the original model kind of went from, it's a physical instance, locked in, and he would posit for that transaction to be unlocked, to be freed, and to made widely available through the e-commerce. And if it's software or music or content IP, through the frictionless distribution. Embellished a little farther with breaking up the bundle. Not only could it be sold online, it could be sold online, and the sum of the value of the selling of the parts was greater than the prior experience in selling the whole. And then the recognition under sub-bullet point 3, building out the long tail. And the long tail, amazingly, is the boutique-y, eclectic, even user-generated stuff. Low volume. Slide number 4, new chapter, chapter 4, from books to screens. And kind of bear with me, I couldn't hold my tongue on this quite so much. And so I'm going to be a little bit of a contrarian. His sense at one level is fine. I mean, I'm fine with the point, which is that we've gone from paper to screens. We've gone from books to screens, and I'm good with that. But he kind of encroaches on this intellectual education space, and I'm going to stop that. So I'm going to be discerning without being personally critical, although all I can ever do is encourage you to study this on your own if it matters to you. So it's kind of like the spoiler alert here. Let me just go right to the spoiler. That he'd like to walk where he walks and drive where he drives and eat where he eats, and he will have content ads. He'll have content that is personalized to his needs, not the least of which is his need to buy. And I say he, referring to Kevin. Okay, it's not universally everybody. It's just sometimes it's all about him. So, I have concerns about an environment that takes our best people and has them focus not on curing cancer or world peace, but better targeted ads. So wherever the author goes, personalized content is delivered. Means that there's a very extensive consumer dossier maintained by one of his merchants of choice, or all of his merchants of choice. I think you can choose to, be with one of those over the others. Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, etc. Not Netflix, but you have to, perhaps choose one of those partners. Didn't have room to put in Yahoo. It implies a very cooperating ecosystem between your phone, your home, your car, the display in your car, and signage in public places, what have you. That's common. And geolocation to an extreme. We'll point out that the Kroger Corporation wants to kind of not only give you better targeted ads personally, but better targeted ads based on where you are in the store going to your handset, which takes the geolocation to a higher level. And Walmart doing the same, kind of a retail thing. One leads, they all follow. Slide number 5. I'll bring this up to you because if you're a good communicator and you're a good understander, and you're brave, then go teach. Look, if you have people that are learning from you, you've become a teacher. Nothing would flatter your professor more that you would, in fact, take a responsible role and lead others through increased knowledge. So go do that. You should care about your education, and here are at least some things to do, or perhaps not to do. Look, there's cameras on these devices, and they can follow your eye. And if you're if your eye doesn't see it, you're not going to learn it. And so we've instrumented through cameras the eye motion. We do it while people drive. We do it while there's cameras on these TVs, and so your responses to ads, are being fed back to the advertisers. Roku, Hulu, Sling, etc. Amazon, Fire TV, Google Chromecast, your relationship with their ads matters to them. So they're watching your eyes. They're watching whether you get up and leave the room. They may be watching other things if you're watching TV. So the eye motion studies indicate that we read less well on screens, and we read much less well on screens that have a smaller form factor. Big drop-off between the tablet and the phone. Trying to read this on your phone is non-wise. Having said that, I travel a bunch, and so I do use the text-to-speech feature a lot, maybe a few times a week. So if I'm driving from Columbus to Athens and I've got something, I will let the text-to-speech feature of my e-reader use the Amazon Kindle Voice View. Go ahead, read Burning the Page by Jason Murkowski. Read Words on Screen by Naomi Barron. Mr. Kelly posits there could be this thing called the networked book. If you'd like to see what other people highlighted, that's pretty good. If you'd like to see how other people comment on your comments on having read a book, more power to you. If you've bought a book used because it was in great condition, had very few highlights, then you're like me. If you bought a book that was extensively highlighted and you thought the highlights were featured for the book, then you're also very smart. There's a difference between learning to read and reading to learn. You learn to read by age 8. You learn to read really well if you were around adults who communicated in presumably vulgarity-free, profanity-free sentences a lot in a domestic setting, maybe measured in the millions of words. That's why people want their kids to watch Sesame Street, because it's better than nothing. But a world without words makes one ill-prepared by the time one enters Ohio 4th grade to be able to read to learn, which is based entirely on context. So you got to learn the decoding part, and then you read to learn based on the framework or mental model of the subject. Mr. Kelly didn't quite make that point. You read and you recognize that every piece of additional information either fits in your framework or disturbs you if it doesn't have any place to go in the framework. And if your framework has a branch for it and there's no content to add to that branch, then you have basically read what isn't there. So there, okay? So this reading thing is non-trivial. Honestly, I don't care about the math. We have Excel for that. We have calculators for that. the machines can do the math for us. We don't need a lot of people to do the math. We need a lot of people to be thoughtful thinkers and critical thinkers, and to read what's there, and to read what isn't there, and to lead and to teach. So there's a difference across generations, but those of us who would like, just in case, they'd read it, maybe take notes, just in case they might need it later. And people that say, I don't need to know anything, exaggeration. I just need to be really good at search because I will always have search. I will always have something in my pocket that I can search on. Two very different paradigms. We teach each one differently. And I don't know you very well. And so you're getting it a little bit of both ways from me. But I will pessimistically wrap up this slide to say, we can't do duality around the human mind because we don't know how the mind works. All right, maybe we know some cases of the mind doesn't work, but it's like we clearly do not have we cannot explain at any level how thinking works, how learning works. We don't know it chemically. We don't know it as any matter of science whatsoever. The state of our art in terms of learning involves doing like brain scans. So it's like, here are the brain scans of people that walk. Here are the brain scans of people that read every day. Here are the brain scans of, bass players. Here are the brain scans of football linemen. Okay, and so, we kind of know, we know enough about genetics to know that we know where to look for answers. We just don't have the compute in order to create genetic remedies for what ails us. I know it's a little bit off topic, but not exactly. 23andMe and Ancestry.com are, have a lot, those lines cross a lot with Google, by the way. And so at some point we'll be able to give you a pill to, cure nearsightedness or male pattern baldness in my case, or whatever, or lupus or fibromyalgia or any of this stuff. And so we're kind of getting there on the genetics front. We are absolutely positively nowhere near that at all on the learning front. So anybody who says, screens are as good as paper, the outcomes, just as a matter of science, don't prove it, and the science is just not there. The lack of science has never stopped Silicon Valley from trying to hustle new products, and that's just the American way. But, I want to blow the whistle a little bit on Mr. Kelly on Chapter 4. To wrap up on Slide 6, to wrap it up. So Bob Metcalfe, who I have not met, had this kind of theory that he had a law. He got a law named after him. Okay? And so we don't exactly interpret the law. We just kind of casually interpret the law. He says the power of a network is like the square. It's like the number squared of the people that are attached to it. So it's like he's the guy that says the power is in the network. Kevin Kelly, absolutely. Artificial intelligence, absolutely. Flowing, screening. The power is in just this huge number and growing number of people and screens attached to the network. So this guy, by the way, kind of serially and invented stuff and then created companies that might take a year off, then go off and invent. He invented the tablet, the local area network, the server. Got a PhD out of it. I've never met him. I don't know what kind of person he is. But, the application to us here is that, community matters. So the community of contributors can be a really good thing. So we're talking about user-generated content in the case of YouTube, user-created content relative to music, basically user-created content in the long tail of the distribution of volumes of units sold on Amazon. And I apologize, it just struck me that I refer to the long tail without drawing the long tail, so I'm going to slip that in on slide number 3 pretty much soon. Community of participants, there are these things called book clubs, or these things called classes, where it's like people at the same time in the same place have a shared consciousness, and it's actually kind of fun to be around. Is it the same in a massively multiplayer online game? I have no idea. So as we wrap up on slide 6, Silicon Valley, Northern California, goes from kind of like San Jose, Santa Clara, San Francisco. The other side is Oakland. A little bit farther up is Berkeley. You can look up the map of Silicon Valley. Apple, Google, HP, Facebook, not Microsoft. Microsoft is in Seattle area. So it's the global model for what I will term predatory innovation. This is where the new product eats the old product. The child devours the parent. This is the business that we've chosen. It is capitalistic. It creates business, creates wealth. It creates new markets. It shows no respect for the incumbent products. The better product will dominate it without exception. It's also a commodity market in that I've referred to maybe occasionally what I call the race to the bottom. The computer that cost $1,000 this year will cost $600 next year and $350 the year after that. And then if you can get it at all, it would be $200 the year after that. And no place else does the unit price decline and conversely for that same $1,000 year over year, what you can buy is like so much better. There's not a huge secondary market for anything in compute. I mean, who wants to buy a flip phone? Nobody wants to. We can't even export this to the developing world. Certain people want burner phones. There's a place in life for burner phones, a time and a place. But it's we don't respect history. We might have a museum, in a place or two, but we commoditize things and we reduce their price, their selling price, and the leaders move on to new markets. This we talk about research and development, this is not overly research, it is very much development. And the development means that the long-term horizon is the exit strategy, which could be measured in just mere years. So it's not like we're looking out. It's not like anybody in this industry is looking out for the long-term public good. It's just not. I mean, capitalism doesn't reward quality. Capitalism is not strong on negative externalities. It's the firstest with the mostest, among other wonderful things. So screening and flowing are the valley. Education, teaching, and learning. Education, teaching, and learning are not the valley. It's not the firstest with the mostest. It's a public good as an externality. I mean, it's not rational to want to make the next generation better off. It's kind of perhaps strangely rational because in our old age they'll be taking care of us. But it's we'd like it to go into our pockets and let us have a good time now. And so the education, teaching, learning stuff doesn't exactly fit the Silicon Valley model. And so that's why I'm a little upset with his rose-colored glass perspective of screens as learning. I will also share with you, although it's off topic, that there's a series of articles in the file to be filed under fear of missing out. The more time on Facebook, just the unhappier people get. If that's not a maxim that is product of a research by professors at an Ivy League school with unassailable statistical data. And so let's not trust the Valley people to be beyond what they are, which is just great merchants. This is the end of U2. It's Module 3, it's Unit 3, Take 6, perhaps. This is chapters 5 and 6 out of the Kevin Kelly book, The Inevitable. The chapter 5 activity is a bunch of lists. He calls it accessing, which is fine, and we'll use that to expand our vocabulary a little bit. Chapter 6 is somewhat political, if you will. The chapter 6 part is about sharing, and it takes us into a couple Silicon Valley value system sorts of things, which is fine. But let me begin on chapter 1 with a little bit deeper depth on what I've described underneath the sharing is ITS principle number one. Maybe this should be its own slide, but let me kind of work within the framework that I've given you, and then some. We may all have cars and driver's licenses, but we cannot all get on the road at once. We certainly cannot all line up behind a traffic light and make it through that same traffic light on one green cycle. The green cycle of the traffic light is based on a reasonable expectation of how many cars will be waiting for a green light. The parking lot, at our favorite big box store is based on not everybody in town driving to that parking lot at the same time. It's based on the peak number of cars that will be expected to show up on the busiest shopping day of the year. Might be the day after Thanksgiving in the U.S. Okay? And so we build these systems for peak, not for everybody. Point made. Second point is, in the network telecom space, we're going to bill every subscriber whether they use the service or not. And so typical mobile phone environment, it's make up a number, $45 a month. Okay? So it's $45 a month whether you use it or not. And if you overuse it and hit the price cap, you'll end up paying more than the $45 that's contractually bound. And so the telecom business is rewarded for having just enough capacity, but not too much, to cover the peak. If you attempt to use capacity that isn't there, well, you're not going to get through that traffic light. You're not going to get a parking spot. You're not going to be able to make that phone call, and then you're going to complain, or worse, maybe you'll go to some other provider, some other vendor, some other store. So the profit equation for us in telecom is everybody pays minus the peak demand, and that's the profit. It takes some money to cover the towers, the fibers, the switches, the personnel to deliver the services at peak demand. But I'll tell you what, peak demand is far short of universal demand. The public policy regulators, the Utilities Commission, the Communication Commission, they all agree this is proper. The municipalities that determine the size of parking lots, the number of lanes, the length of the traffic lights, they agree with this. Okay, it happens at communications and transportation. Our math looks amazingly alike. So ITS principle number one is like, how do you make money at this stuff? Well, you charge everybody, and you only have to spend money on the peak demand. You don't have to spend money on everybody. You just have to spend money on the number of concurrent users, and the rest makes the investors happy. The other thing to kind of go with this, and it just struck me today, that air traffic control often also works by this principle of the control plane. You got the planes that are taking off and landing and flying. In addition to the planes that are taking off and landing and flying, you have the air traffic controllers that are separating the planes, that are directing them where to go, when to wait, when to start. Okay, and so that is a control plane, and the product is aircraft. Well, we have a control plane, except the product is data. I have a control plane, it's called like the dean and the registrar, and my production plane is I teach students. And there's a supervisory control and management plane over me. The air traffic control thing is tangible. You get that? The management and control plane over me, the teacher, is kind of a story. But I need that paradigm to make this stuff work, because the only way I can manage the resources well enough to make sure everybody gets served and nobody complains, and I've only built for like 10% of the peak demand, or 10% of the total demand, is by having to be really, really good at the logistics of coordination. That is a lot of talk, and we're still on like the first block of slide one. And kind of a briefing as we go forward. The book provides what I've described as a recurring combination of product innovation and business acumen, the business smarts. And you know, communication professionals have a huge role in this equation above, which is profit equals, you know, revenue minus expense, where the communicators who are defining the market and creating the market and keeping the market and the subscribers and the customers happy are excellent at perceiving value, you know, and messaging this. And so I think that is so important, you know, in all aspects of tech. The infrastructure, my majors, my vendors, we're expense. We're not revenue. So the revenue is, you know, in a market-driven economy in the eye of the beholder, and that is in the hands of the communicators. Do that well, please, and responsibly. The technical implementation is, you know, this is where you invoke duality against me. It's like you say, we need to go make this work, and then the tech people have to go make it work any way we can. The rule of the day seems to be, you know, HD streaming Netflix on phones, which is not exactly the easiest thing to do when there's only so much capacity, and people with their smartphones are free to travel. You know, you don't have to you are not geographically at a fixed location. We've given you mobility. So the only thing I can say going forward in this is that there's a little bit of a disconnect between centralized and decentralized in this chapter, and so bear with me. I will trip over that at least once on the slide number 2. Mr. Kelly gives us 5 tech trends. Number 1 is an interesting concept: dematerialization. If the metric is the weight per dollar of gross domestic product produced, then we are becoming more efficient at growing the economy with less weight. Well, you know, that's because software doesn't weigh anything. So the value, I mean, it's not like this ratio is dropping and we're not contributing to the economy. We're contributing year over year more and more to the economy through the internet. It just doesn't weigh anything. And so, yeah, it's dematerialized. There's no aluminum or steel or plastic necessarily involved. We used to have to ship, you know, we used to burn discs, put discs in the mail, use Federal Express. Don't do any of that. We used to have to install stuff on our machines. We don't do that anymore. We download it or we run it from the cloud. So that puts a greater reliance on the network. It puts a greater reliance on the expert control in the control plane. And we'll close this bullet with this very important part of software as a service, platform infrastructure. Things are services provided by resources that are software-based, living in the cloud where they're very well defended. Uber and Lyft are transportation as a service. Lodging as a Lyft. Well, we've always had hotels and motels, but now we've got Airbnb to create greater supply, which not only might create its own demand, but it also dilutes the cost of things by having more inventory in the room space. Healthcare as a service, education as a service. You're the pioneers doing this distance learning stuff. You get at least the OU version is the best of both worlds. You generally are having real professors teach your class and creating your work and paying attention to you. And you've got Ohio University. We are very well aware of who our online competitors are and what their strengths and their weaknesses are. And I'm glad you're here. To be direct, point number 2, real-time on demand. You know, there's where he dusts off his business acumen. Yeah, there's a lot of underutilized resources, and so, you know, there's some things that can be, you know, delivered on demand in real time. Why would you bother to own a car when you can call a car? Why necessarily, you know, do you need to purchase something if you can just rent it for the duration that you use it? If you know, and it's an avalanche or snowball kind of effect. Next generation doesn't want cars; they want transportation. They want freedom and mobility. They have this expert control plane. They can just go onto the app and request the vehicle. That's their version of the control plane over the transportation plane. It's pretty genius. It's pretty genius. The pricing folks have to be very good at this, because the businesses that are coordinating this are not making their money off the value of the trip so much as the value of the transaction overall. And so they have, a multi-dimensional problem to solve, and a lot of this has to do with the equivalent of search pricing, that when there's peak demands, how much is too much to charge for the service? Or on the other hand, it's like, we're going to lose our drivers if we don't get them some trips. And I should not be dating my lectures here, but we are in the midst of a hurricane right now in Florida. Hurricane off the coast of Florida, which is affecting travel plans and the price of hotel rooms and trips. We have excess capacity now because people cancel trips. Decentralization is not what he means in this. That we have, on the one hand, there are certain functions that we have deployed in edge devices, while centralizing some others. We've talked at length about the client-server nature of things. The magnet, is ultimately everything ends up in the cloud, ultimately, again, which is where computing started when I started more than a couple years ago. The topic in 3 was decentralization, was Bitcoin cryptocurrency to take the means of exchange away from the banks and the revenue streams of the banks. And so it's an interesting discussion. This is not our discussion. I could give you a book to read if you wanted to beg for some extra credit on the cryptocurrency activities. I think mostly it's bad people trying to hide from the authorities, whether they're the taxing authorities or the law enforcement authorities. And so, I don't see the need to spend a lot of time for that. However, I will say that the blockchain distributed ledger approach to big-time institutional commerce probably has legs, and there's a future for that. On to slide number 3, continuing our tech trends. This notion of an ecosystem is significant. This refers to perhaps non-captive partners who are contributing to the greater good of the Microsoft or Google or Apple platforms. Amazon is a shopping platform. The iPhone and Mac OS are software operational platforms. Windows in its variants are platforms, and it's a conscious decision of a third-party independent business to decide to make their stuff run on Mac OS, to run on Windows, to run on Android, to run on the Windows Phone, to run on the BlackBerry. It's a conscious decision, and those are deemed ecosystems. Sometimes they present themselves as having a store, like the Apple Store or the BlackBerry Store or the Windows Store, although you'd be hard-pressed to buy a Windows Phone these days. It happened that some of these, he did correctly use the expression multi-sided or two-sided markets, where basically it's the merchant, is not the owner, the asset, or the inventory. eBay, Alibaba, which is kind of the Chinese version of Amazon, and a whole bunch of other things. The Google, the Microsoft, Apple, the BlackBerry Store are third-party software being sold to, the first-party consumer with a little bit of help from the intermediary, which may or may not take a cut. Generally, they have something to gain from having these third parties produce. And then the final point on this is the clouds. And the cloud is, I've described as another approach to sharing. There are private clouds. The Ohio University Data Center is a private cloud that contains probably, make up a number, 500 applications that are running basically on 50 boxes. They're just time sharing their access to these resources. We typically use a software environment called VMware, which is important in commercial and an area of possible specialization. As a class, we'll identify cloud service providers that can provide platforms in the cloud and software in the cloud. So it happens at the Oracle database, Office 365, this thing called Salesforce, the IBM Explorus medical diagnosis thing, our software as a service, where you're basically paying per subscriber per year for the service that happens to be running on one or more of their machines reliably and securely. The platform of this as a service and infrastructure as a service, which I did not list, is a lot more a la carte. Provides one basically to get out of the hardware business. As a brief aside, we're having kind of a startup business technology weekend thing coming up here at Ohio University, and one of the prizes will be so many free hours or minutes of use of the Google Cloud. And it could be operationally, I believe, well into the hundreds of hours of compute time as like a reward. And it is properly priced, and there's a true value that can be monetized for the grand prize. So hey, if you want to go start up a new business and it's all software based, you don't have to buy any computers. You just do it all inside Google, and they'll give you the first few hundreds of hours of compute time. And then if they really likely, they'll buy you. But there's a ladder kind of scaffolded approach. So it's like, why do you have to even bother buying the computers or the software licenses or hiring that person who attended the computers and the software licenses? You just click, and you are developing inside Microsoft, Oracle, IBM, Amazon, etc. Third-party partners. Keywords, hypervisor. Hypervisor is this little shim of software that allows these virtual machines to run. A virtual machine can look like anything you want it to be. You click it and you get it. Those machines, of course, are emulated images of machines, but a multi-core server in the Amazon cloud, you would really have no direct relationship with. You would not even really know its identity unless you really cared, which you shouldn't. And it's running perhaps 100 separate virtual emulated workstations on it or something. The cloud approach implements security practices better than most companies can do on its own, and it's also a good repository for backups, which could be retrieved. Doing things on the cloud means you better connect to the cloud very well, meaning through a couple different separate links, which is also good for the networking business, although one of those links could be wireless, which is a little easier to accomplish. The cloud approach enables and accelerates new companies and concepts that Netflix, runs entirely on Amazon. So Netflix could not have scaled up as quickly as it did unless it, had a great partner with a lot of capacity and a lot of physical presences around the country. Then, of course, Amazon has Prime Video now, so they're competing with themselves. Slide number 4, Chapter 6 on sharing. It's not about sharing. It's not about sharing the network. It's not about sharing the server. It's about people sharing the effort to develop software, particularly to give it away for free. Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, Jeff Bezos are not enamored with software being $0. They're invested in commercial off-the-shelf software that is annuitized, that could generate a revenue stream for Microsoft every year. It costs money to deliver Office 365, and you pay it, or we pay it, or the university pays for it. All right? Just to bring this up, if Google or Yahoo is giving you mail for free, then presumably they're getting at least that much back in value. Well, that value that they're extracting from you, the user of their free service, is access to your demographic profile and your search history, which is the lever for better targeted ads. So I don't know, if the street price is like $2 to $5 a month for email, and you're not paying the couple to $5 a month for email, then somebody must think that your identity and purchase history is worth that much. Yet you need to buy this pair of shoes instead of that pair of shoes, might earn that money all back in one transaction. Okay? So the Valley, Silicon Valley, is actually, I think it was like oranges or avocados. US 101 goes from San Francisco all the way, it's the El Camino Real. It goes all the way to San Diego and beyond. And Interstate 5 goes through the valley, and then there's San Francisco Bay, and then there's like Oakland, which we're not going to talk about. But the West Bay part is kind of the genius factory. Not a lot of fabrication or assembly other than Intel makes chips there. It's also kind of sitting on the San Andreas Fault, so it's not really a good place to make stuff like computer chips. So most of that is in China anyway. But the people are there. People are there, legions of people like us, developing new products and writing software, etc. Value is about wealth creation through the perceived value in intellectual property is monetized, by the stock market. Okay, most valuable company in the universe is Apple, based presumably off the Apple ecosystem built around the iPhone. Okay, and they make a huge amount of money every time they sell one of those things in the U.S. And the ecosystem, which is very coherent and very well disciplined for the software apps that end up on iPhones. Not in the book. Software is licensed, not owned, which limits liability. You can't sue somebody if you are just licensing their thing. If you bought it, then there's a breach of contract. Does not apply on the licensing side. And the software licenses are generally renewable licenses that have an annual fee, which I call annuitized. Okay, a little bit of the capitalism thing. I'll just do this quickly because I know you don't want economics in a tech class, nor do the face-to-face students. The investors want not their money back. The lenders want their money back. The investors want their ownership to be worth more, so at some point, presumably, they could sell it. So, in a really competitive market, the presence of competitors means you can't just raise your price. The price changes are inelastic. If you raise your price, you lose market share. And so there's some slight differences that might matter if you have like zero or no market share. You can take greater risks. And if you have a lot of market share, then you kind of act like a monopoly. And monopolies are not foreign to the telecom business. In fact, telecom, energy, electricity, transportation, deep down, those really are monopolistic in value. But, this is America. We love markets. We love that we love markets. Okay? Some products are priced below cost, predatory pricing in order to eliminate competitors. If they can't cover their cost and they lose money every time they sell one, then they're not going to be selling one for long. That happens. It's pretty ruthless. Bundling is a fairly genius move. I think that's kind of like a 90s thing, probably from the business schools in the 90s. So the part that everybody wants in Office is Word. They don't want Excel. Excel is a second-rate spreadsheet package, but no one would have bought Excel if it weren't for Word, and nobody would have bought PowerPoint if it weren't for Word. But the only way you could get Word was you'd have to buy these other things, and the pricing was appropriate. You don't know who Lotus 123 was. You don't know who Harvard Graphics was. You don't know who Foxbase was. But by the time Microsoft bundled Access and PowerPoint and Excel in with Word, they put WordPerfect out of business. They put the number one. They put all the number twos out of business and some of the number ones out of business, and that was the virtue of the bundle. And now Mr. Kelly says, well, let's break up the bundle, because perhaps there's more. Perhaps these people that really want their Harvard Graphics are willing to overpay more than the bundled price, in order to get what they want. Because this is there's no penalty. There's no penalty in the cloud for having, virtual copies and virtual inventory of specialized software available. It's not like it's taking up space in a warehouse. It's just sitting in the cloud someplace. And so, if the cloud is the medium, then obviously the long tail distribution makes the bundle less attractive, hard to believe. All right. And some organizations that have scale and scope, which means they're integrated, which is a different kind of bundling, is what's considered monopolistic behavior. The definition of a monopolist is kind of like a cult. The definition of a cult is you can't leave. The definition of monopoly is you don't have any other choice, and therefore the monopoly, if left on its own, would charge whatever it wanted to, generally a higher number. And so we frown upon monopolies, but companies that act like monopolies that aren't, in our culture have been getting kind of a free pass. So having a monopoly in search, nobody's gone to jail for that. Having a monopoly in social media hasn't been a problem just yet. Having a near monopoly in cloud computing has not really caused any problems. It's only like September of 2019. But politically speaking, it's very likely that these things do get split up at time because monopolies just in generally are less disciplined and they behave poorly and there are consequences. And so, yeah, this stuff matters. Slide number 5, if that wasn't enough, I've got an entire slide called attitudes. So Silicon Valley is described as libertarian. I don't have a footnote for that. It's kind of neutral on these social sorts of things that affect the public, and so the Valley is based on taking companies public and stock price and, the income for the founders and the managers. Gates and Microsoft build Office with a capital O and then use market power to raise its prices. And so he's kind of against this thing called open source. Open source is just, random people collaborating to develop software together. Gates did not want Apple to succeed because Apple's a competitor. You don't want your competitors to succeed naturally. But he made sure that they had just enough to stay in business. Microsoft has been scrutinized for anti-competitive behavior, and if they behave well as good citizens occasionally, sometimes that's enough to defer the dead hand of government from disciplining them. Now it happens that, some of the open source movements are not as they seem. They're not like nice people donating their labor to contribute to software packages that can be distributed for free. Sometimes they're other motivated firms like AT&T, Oracle, and Microsoft. They're developing an open source because even cheap cannot compete against free. And there are situations where theoretically they could make it unprofitable for any other business to enter a product line, just by giving the software away for free. And so this is another way, not just of destroying your competitor, but stopping a competitor from even starting up. Isn't that nice? And doubly so, it's perceived as a community effort, as a good thing. And in fact, right now we're dealing with this thing called GitHub, that these companies would like you, in deference to your letters of recommendation and your transcripts, show us how well you write code, and you could be a more attractive person to hire. Arguably, half of the hires are on contract, half are employees. So it's like if you're willing to do a tryout of sorts by sharing the software that you create through this thing called GitHub, then you will attract attention of major employers like Amazon and Microsoft and Facebook. And following, last point, not to belabor that, but it's not just programs, but information that can be open sourced. And information that's been open sourced and provides anonymity to the source, tends to give voice to marginalized and extreme voices, choosing my words very carefully. And so the open sourcing information on a large scale, history is showing is just not working out quite so well for us. So wrapping up Unit 3, kind of a rehash from some other things. they said decentralization and meant blockchain. They said decentralization. Cloud is really centralization, and so that's just an out-and-out contradiction. But just to wrap up, these trends are important. Software and cloud dominate our field right now because you cannot. I mean, the economics are just so completely attractive. Centralized in the cloud, where we have proximity to lots of other data, we have effortless and frictionless low-cost distribution of everything through the networks attached to the cloud, and there's some benefit from the commonality of approach. And implied with this, for those of us in the crunchy side of ITS, the networking is ubiquitous, has high capacity, and all these network things are great, and year over year they cost less for the same amount of great. So, what about the character of the tech industry? I mean, I don't want to go too far with that. You've experienced it as consumers. What are they motivated by? What do they value more highly than other things, or value less than other things? What is the conduct of the firms relative to investors, to the public, to the government, to the consumers? And, what's the reward system? I think we all work in harmony with the reward system put before us. New products make people wealthy. The firstest with the mostest, is very good. We get degrees, perhaps out of intellectual curiosity, but we get degrees in a pragmatic sense to become more employable. We love learning, and so we're hopefully using all 33 minutes of this recording to make this an opportunity to learn more. There's no way I can test over this stuff in the kind of detail that we wanted. Besides, my testing is attuned or aligned with the main points on these slides. And in a Module 3 quiz, it's going to have 5 vocabularies and 3 essays. We're going to have 36 slides of 3 points each. That's 108, call it 100 plus little factoids that we could draw upon. And my budget is 8 questions, so that's kind of like 10 to 1. So I wish you well with that. I hope that you appreciate the learning in addition to the discipline of doing well with your classes. Thanks for your time. It's Module 3, Unit 4 of ITS 2010. Today we cover Chapters 7 and 8 of the Kelly book, The Inevitable. I think this is the high point of the book, not that it actually decreases following this. Maybe it plateaus a little bit. The 2 chapters that we cover are entitled Filtering and Remixing. We do take a couple steps deeper into the industry of the internet and technology in the Valley. We begin with a quote from attributed to, I believe, Herbert Simon. Not that it matters. In a world of abundance, the only scarcity is human attention. The abundance is compute, of information, of networking, of storage, the infinitely elastic cloud that all these kind of resources fit into. But there's only like one of you, and you only have so many moments a day, and they are there's a competition for them. A couple of really quick comments. Chapter 7, I think, is just outstanding. Chapter 7, hopefully, you've read it yet, and maybe you don't have to agree, but hopefully you'll have found some really interesting stuff in there. I think there's one little kind of misstep, one miscue in the bunch. Chapter 8 has some very interesting consequences and takeaways, and I'll extend to that just a little bit memorable sorts of things. Realizing, again, the tests come from the slides, the tests don't come from the book. The book is approachable. I guess I've decided for these last 3 sets of slides, in this book anyway, just to give you some references if you are interested in some other things. I find this genre to be fascinating. The technical stuff, and honestly, the technical people, I think, are pretty, shall we say, routine or boring or predictable. When people who have standing in both the user space, the user-consumer kind of domain, or the business domain, and along with technology, then there's plenty of a conversation going on. Because we have referred time and again to Amazon. Amazon perhaps is the larger of the corporate themes going through the book. The Everything Store by Brad Stone is kind of an unauthorized biography of Jeff Bezos and the formation of Amazon and the Amazon principles. It's not the only book. Obviously, I refer to The Long Tail, which I think is worth scrutiny. And then it'll make sense when I get into Chapter 8, which is about primarily about audio and entertainment. But I can't deny there's a lot of interest in video games and esports and game design, certainly by my home academic unit, if not The Ohio State University. And this book is a quick read. It's kind of available as a PDF for $0, but it's around in print. And I met the guy. He came and spoke at an event near us. Slide number 2, filtering. We have too much, the abundance, the plenitude, the plenty of electronic content, digital content. It forces us to have to filter. We certainly just cannot consume all of this stuff. We cannot just let YouTube roll. So it happens there was a big pivot, a big change in our mode of operation where we used to just store everything on our devices. We used to pay exorbitantly more for storage in our phones or our iPads, and even in our computers, but that's for a different reason. Now we actually just, because we're connected all the time, we can stream the content live legally. Those formal organizations that stream content do pay the royalties to the author, publisher, distributor, whomever it is, the record labels, the composers, that all those folks get paid, which is better than just simply taking and sharing content. Kelly makes and he's not the only one to make it, but the amount of stuff generated over time has accelerated, and so if we are able to prepare an environment that captures next year's stuff, then we have enough capacity to perhaps encode and store everything that's ever been created in any format kind of whatsoever. To digress briefly, I've actually visited a place in Cleveland called Overdrive, which obtains paper. It obtains books on paper, saws the spines off the books, so it turns from a bound book into loose pages, scans and converts the contents of those printed pages into words, then edits the words, and can do one or both of the following. They could have the ebook then prepared as a scan from the paper book, which they always do, and secondarily have a narrator, have voice talent record the audiobook for the same. So no longer is it scarce, just 10 copies. There's, infinite copies. And pleased to say that the Overdrive folks up in, I want to call it, it's not Maple Heights, one of the heights by the bridge up in Cleveland, does this. And then our OCLC organization in Dublin, Ohio, is the Library Card Catalog Curator, which is the library used by Ohio University, all the higher ed, and nearly all of the public libraries. Bullet number 3, 500 hours of YouTube video uploaded every minute, and 250 million hours viewed daily. Got to be somewhat cautious with M. M in Latin is milla, which is 1,000, but big M is mega, and so that's like a huge amount of content viewed daily, at the expense of other things we might do. Kelly offers on slide 2 a pretty good list of filters, both human and automatic, and we're going to call them by another name as well. There are gatekeepers and intermediaries and curators. Not every book gets published. Not every book is sold by Barnes and Noble, let alone on the shelf of the library. Some of us, in fact, have self-published. I have this kind of a experiment, self-published through Kindle. That is an interesting option. It depending on one's productivity in the English language, one could make a living out of self-publishing things that people would actually like to read. We'll say that. The value of brands is beyond my ability to describe, but we certainly extend trust to certain brands. We describe a brand as having equity and the roles of some people to protect and defend or manage a particular brand. The essence of Procter & Gamble is not that we see the name Procter & Gamble quite so much, but they manage brands like Tide and kind of associate that with not just a value based on what the stuff cost, but a value that is kind of extrinsic as appreciated by consumers. So, where do prices come from? They don't really necessarily always have to come from cost. In a commodity market, they do. But the selling price is based on what people are willing to pay, which there's a lot going into that. It's beyond the scope of me to get into that. Hopefully there's another class somewhere in the major that could encourage you to spend time on that. Government and culture are also screening content that is non-appropriate. But we have culture informally, I guess I should say formally, but through norms of acceptable behavior. Our friends themselves actually are a huge influence on and in fact, our commercial relationships and what we listen to, what's cool, etc. And so the influencers are an important emerging role in a mediated world of filtering. And finally, the recommendation engines themselves, from you name it. I probably would have associated the Netflix recommender is kind of the most sophisticated of the bunch. Google through ads is just not really recommending. Google is auctioning off your attention to the highest bidder, literally in real time. Not just the YouTube channel, but YouTube obviously can queue up things that will capture your attention. Google, Netflix, Amazon, etc. To some extent, they, we'll get into this. They're monetizing your attention. And same with e-commerce. E-commerce says if you like this garment item, perhaps other people considered looking at the following. Kelly, interestingly enough, had this notion of a universal recommender with a capital U, and his recommender knows his clothes size. I find that somewhat pernicious that, obviously insurance companies would like to collect premiums but not expend claims payments, and so there are consequences perhaps of your body shape and size and BMI, among other things, being shared openly. But there is an emerging business in customization that if your sizes are kept on file, one leg's longer than the other by a quarter inch, then you can have custom garments made. And what becomes of that information, I don't know. But Mr. Kelly thought that was pretty cool. On to slide number 3. One of my recently retired colleagues in the communication taught a class called Media Economics. Sounds like it's an idea worth, its own category, as it were. But, this is where your attention is actually not just valuable, it's valued. I mean, your attention is not just in a soft, kind of personal sense. We appreciate your attention. We're going to put a price tag on that. And, this is the advertising business, and that is also really something else. If brands were invented in Cincinnati, advertising was invented in Cleveland. And, we are Ohio University after all. Cost per, impressions, eyeballs paired, presumably. Your attention participating in internet, newspaper, and TV watching are valued, respectively at $3.60 an hour, which, is not minimum wage. Reading the newspaper, less than that, although those are active activities, and TV watching, kind of passive activity. But this gets better. It happens that your entertainment dollars, he averages out. Go to the movies, on a per ticket basis, that the kinds of things we do entertainment wise are in the order of dollars per hour. I am not embarrassed to say that education as entertainment, if you look at the educational aspects, not the room and board aspects of this, to some extent, we are one continuous ad promoting Ohio University. Maybe instructors don't think that way, but every day it's green and white. For me, not that I wear that, although a lot of our staff members are issued uniforms in the green and white scheme. But if we're not reinforcing our brand and promoting our image, then we are non-differentiated with, a bunch of other schools in the MAC or Publix in Ohio or et cetera. And so we're very conscious of not only the OU brand, but the segment of people that this brand appeals to. And so, so we're an ad. And we're a somewhat expensive ad, but nothing compared to what's going to happen next, because you've read ahead that this IPTV, your smart or connected TV or your whatever it is, Roku, Hulu, et cetera, Amazon, Prime TV, Sling, because these are very targeted ads, then your attention is actually worth a lot of money. I will mention, as a Roku subscriber, let's say we have an athletic event or something interesting happening someplace else. The Roku technology will insert local ads into my stream. So somewhere there's a Roku server, probably within 100 miles of me would be my guess, 150 miles, that when TV station or what have you signals an ad break, that the jukebox will serve up an ad for my market, not for where the TV content is originating. There you go. So that is worth $15 to $50 an hour in the insert. Now, of course, we're looking at 30-second ads. And so you can do that appropriately, but it's a brave new world of advertising. So the person, next room over, let's assume that we're all logged in on different Netflix accounts, or we're on different Roku accounts. You and your significant other could be 100 miles apart, each watching the same program, kind of modern togetherness, and you'd get different ads, presumably if you weren't sharing the same user ID. Now, again, this is the high point, I think, of the book, because this is, in real time, in a very granular sense, putting a price tag on you to services that are cheap or free. Google AdWords and AdSense, Google and Facebook are like the universe's largest advertising agencies, meaning they sell more ads than any other entity under the sun. And you say, wait, Google is search, Facebook is my quote friends, and they're in the business of delivering a free service to you and using their accumulated demographic, psychographic, sociographic profiles of you to give you ads. And of course, these are cross-referenced to obviously your ability to pay. Let me make that really clear, that if the selling price of the service is free, then the product actually is you, and your attention is being sold to somebody else. It's not a pejorative, negative kind of statement. It is what it is, and we don't know what the guardrails need to be around that. But right now, that's over $100 billion a year for Google. That's a large amount of money, is $100 billion. The budget of Ohio University is like $500 million. The budget of The Ohio State University is about $10 billion. And this is like 10 times one of the major institutions under the sun. The annual budget for state government in Ohio probably weighs in at about $50 billion. So this is just their, that this is the profit, to be specific, the profit off their ads. And it happens that their cost for doing the ads is nil, and so the revenue and the profit pretty much match up. Google knows the content of every website. It is constantly reviewing everything on the internet and has associated or indexed those websites, period. It knows the interest of each advertiser because the advertisers will sign up by keywords, and they will self-announce. The advertisers in the model that we currently operate, the advertisers or their agents are active actors in this. And then, of course, there's the user, and the user is known. Google knows you better than your significant other does in terms of what you've searched for and cross-referencing you into your transaction stream financially. An auction generates unique results per user per every search. An auction takes place. A computer program is run between the moment you click on something or hit the enter key after putting something in the search box. A computer program is run just for you, not merely to execute the search, but to determine the search order of results and the ads that show up on the right-hand side. Maximizing the placement, the order in which the ads or even results appear, and the ranking, are all part of this, and that is kind of flat rated. And if you actually click on one of these links, then if it's one of the commercial links, then the advertiser gets charged a little bit more. These are microtransactions. These are, pennies per, but these are pennies per that over the course of, I believe, I have a statistic for the number of searches done per year. It is just an incredible number. Finally, in a profound statement as we move off slide number 3, because we have abundance, abundance is driving the unit cost of everything to zero. So, search to us is zero. Where it's a commodity, you could use DuckDuckGo or Yahoo or Bing or Google or maybe something else. So the abundance part has turned that into a commodity, and it's not differentiated by results. It's only differentiated by price, and it's like those are all free. What's not free is you, and as a consequence, the value of experience is rising, especially in terms of luxury. And these are lessons that even happen, that even matter to us in the education space. If you haven't been to Athens, I hope you do at some part of your educational experience. We are entrusted with maintaining the uniqueness of the Athens experience, and given the price of the Athens experience, it technically would be considered a luxury good. For that matter, I went to Akron U. Akron U is a luxury good by comparison, given that the alternatives are free libraries and low-cost online degrees, much lower cost than ours. And there are those, that. So the value of experience is rising, and more so even in the luxury space. Good stuff. Slide, take a breath. That was really good stuff. On to slide number 4, called remixing. Remixing, sounds to me like, some sort of audio technique. We have a degree in media with specializations in audio and in audio recording, and I recall that in order to be a major in our audio track, you must, in fact, be a musician or have been a musician. In order to have the some understanding of music, maybe written music, hard to say. Anyway, the notional, remixing is not just content. It's remixing both content and adapting the medium itself. that strictly speaking, remixing is to reuse old content. This is now about transference to different channels. This texting thing. Twitter is texting. There's a reason why, these messages are short. The whole notion of Twitter is terse comments and short links, which is the same delivery mechanism as texting, which is the same delivery mechanism that was kind of an overthought or afterthought within how to make mobile networks work. There was no texting in wired phones. There was a wireless channel set aside when we created cell phones to carry the control plane, and so the control plane is done through the text channel, which is a bunch of short messages. Hard to believe. And so that text channel, that control channel, was then shared with the masses to send short messages via text. And the next thing you know, we're sending thousands a month. And then that becomes passé, and we do that with Twitter because we have tags, and we don't have to remember numbers quite so much. We have a one-to-many feature built into Twitter. We have kind of a one-to-one model for doing texting. And that's just reusing the control channel on cell. Hard to believe. So, if we go back through our prior topics, we did flows, fixity, versus fluidity, sharing to the highest degree. This chapter, begins with a little talk about music. It goes into video and points out that, pretty much the model of video is, thousands upon thousands of hours, multi-million-dollar productions in small quantity to be viewed once from beginning to end and maybe twice. And I will refer to that as linearly. He asserts that the volume of new films per year in Hollywood is like 600 a year. We sometimes watch Bollywood, which is kind of the Indian version because it's like musical and generally upbeat type stuff. So Hollywood is 600 a year globally, much larger number. But really it's all about user-generated content. So it's the user-generated content. It's the camera in your phone, and it's multi-mode journalists with their iPads who are, doing live shots and doing field work with a tablet on a Unipod. Also want you to consider that video games are another form of experience in the video realm. On to slide number 5, whereas movies are linear, and it's like you can't back up the film. It happens that, the first principle to be invoked, whether it was TiVo or DVD or VCR or what have you, is the rewindability. Rewindability, I didn't know was a word. It's a word. So we have rewindable content. And he, I really didn't pay attention to this because I'm not like a series watcher type person, but House of Cards, Game of Thrones, the binge watching thing of, watching, successive seasons of Friends, that he describes as 120-hour movies, which is interesting idea. The offset is perhaps, we're supposed to be in school. Those of us right now are generally working multiple jobs and going to school. School is a job for many. I think part of the Athens experience should be the Athens experience, not, sitting someplace watching Netflix, my opinion, which, I'm being your professor briefly. And then I will point out that the games is video and it's nonlinear. And, as we have to understand that sometimes shared experiences are very powerful, in that I did not consider games as a foundation to my recreation or my entertainment. just not there. I think because I'm a parent, I've bought a bunch of these things, and it's like, nobody really took to it. I'm very much aware that a large number of people are really into the games, and that I will merely call games as non-linear. That in a single-player game, you're ascending levels, which is why that Flint Dille book is such a big deal. If you wanted to understand the structure and the mindset, the objective of the game is to keep you in the game longer and longer. Period. And so the final point on slide 5 is what he referred to as findability, another word that I didn't ever type until this class, that some smart guy at Stanford said images and video are the dark matter of the internet. Well, that must be kind of an old quote because we have license plate readers, we do facial recognition, we have surveillance society many places around the globe, and I think in some some venues that are high consequence, we are constantly recording everything, and we can FR folks. Perhaps it's not it's not reliable for authentication. None of this biometric stuff is tight enough to be truly authenticated, but not all we do in life has to stand up to the standards of evidence of a courtroom. And so, having an idea of somebody is, findability in video, is inevitable. So let's wrap it up as we're coming up on the 30-minute mark on Unit 4 today. Wealth and income are different things. Silicon Valley has an incentive system of creating wealth, which can then be kept or used or by a football team or a newspaper, or pass along to your family, as Mr. Walden did with Walmart. That's a little different from income. Income generating in the U.S., income is taxed, wealth is not. So sometimes the perverse incentive is to accumulate wealth and to leverage wealth, and then income, is a separate number. And so our value calculus, as we look at these things, it's not necessarily about the public good. Perhaps the roots of Facebook were more personal and social than financial. But, the calculus of Silicon Valley, by the time something becomes a product, there's the business case for it. The telecom calculus, which is unique, it's they called it an ITS principle. One of the things that makes information in telecom systems distinctive is this probabilistic usage pattern. The billing is certain, the usage is probabilistic, and our calculus was an economic model that would repay the investors, repay the lenders, and satisfy the investors, and to make sure all the employees got paid. And so telecom has been pretty solid. Telecom, in fact, until the last 20 years, has been a really boring field. Boring kind of field. Cell phones through the flip phone, very kind of boring. So let's wrap up with a couple ideas. We mentioned Metcalfe's law before. Metcalfe was a tech guy, PhD type. So the power of the network is not just the number of people on it. It's like that number squared. And so let's take Mr. Metcalfe and say there's power to community. Gordon Moore, there's an HBO series called *Halt and Catch Fire*. I believe, somebody portrays him in this as another, PhD type tech person. And this chart to the right is a big deal. By the way, those are exponents, those are logarithms on the left-hand side. And it basically says that every 18 months we can double the density of our electronics, which means every 18 months we can do twice as much for the same amount of money and space and energy. Or you could say every 18 months what we used to do should cost half. And that's only been true since the 1970s through today. We're cheating at the end, and I'm not sure this Moore's Law thing is going to last forever. But, practically for whatever we do, in 18 months, electronically, it should cost half. It probably will cost less than half. And in the face of that abundance, it's really hard to make a living in the hardware business. selling equipment, even in the chip business, because the obsolescence is so fast. And you might say, well, all I really want to do is type my essays. Then that's fine. And, you can do that on a $100 Chromebook or a $200 Windows laptop from Asus or Acer, or a $1,000, MacBook Air. Basically they all have the same parts on the inside. But this abundance gives us the opportunities to create content, and while hardware has a race to the bottom, we're doing all our functions in software, and software is weightless, energy, weightless, massless, $0 to reproduce. And so, the Moore's Law thing is the 18 months part, price equals price divided by 2. So you as the communicators have this rapidly expanding opportunity set to take what your perceptions of new uses might be and to dialogue with technical people to go invent things. The underlying economics make it hard for any electronic asset to appreciate in value. You graduate, you go buy a car. Next year it's worth, 75% of what it was the year before. Less so, depending on how you would drive it. Every other thing turns into a depreciable asset, but our depreciable assets decline in their unit cost to produce over time. Land, I guess if it's not like in Youngstown, appreciates year over year, perhaps. Those brand managers work very hard to make sure the equity and wealth in a company is worth more year over year. Hopefully our personal relationships are worth more year over year. We work really hard to make sure the value of your degree increases year over year. You want us to do that. Some of us try really hard to go and do that. In electronics, it's just not so. So in electronics, it's generally not even worth melting them down for the gold in the contacts. Thank you for listening. We'll do Unit 5 next. ITS 2010, Module 3, Unit 5. This is like take 12, based on having phone calls and discovered a few moments into the lecture that it actually wasn't very good. It happens. Unit 4 took us into the economics of the economics of why businesses productize applications and where the value comes from. Surprise, the value is you. And it's interesting that it can be measured. But we wrapped up the Unit 4 on Moore's Law. Moore's Law technically was only about the density of transistors in integrated circuits becoming more dense, doubling in their density every 18 months, every year and a half or so. And density is, mass per unit volume, so it's kind of a 3D phenomenon. So it's a very techie kind of measurement, but we didn't like that. So we really pretty much said that, well, Moore's Law is this perennial trend of the doubling, not accelerating, but the doubling of the capability of every electronic device every year and a half or year or so. And so technically we don't need to get into that, whether it's 2D or 3D transistors. And what is a transistor? Let's just take it that unlike anything else that we ever touch, the incremental cost to purchase the next one every year or so is like dramatically less. And because it's dramatically less, we buy dramatically more. And because, we continue to chase more and more and more, that, we basically have more storage space than stuff that we could actually store. We have so much compute power. The most of the time the computer is like sitting and waiting for you to move the mouse. We have interesting problems. We have so much information that we store and share stuff that may have honestly very little value to others. So Chapter 9 is on the interactive part. Chapter 10 is about the tracking part. Give you a little heads up. It's a little subtle in the book, But in the same way that the author did not want to talk about the negative aspects of, infinite flowing and sharing, and he didn't want to kind of focus on the negative aspects of tracking, and we'll get to that. So slide number 2, interacting. Well, people have intellect, will, and emotion, and anything that's a computer has got a processor, has got memory that will store a program, and will have interactive features for interfacing, the most important of which is the user interface, keyboard, video, mouse, touchpad, etc. Network interfaces, wired, wireless, kind of, etc. There's kind of a sidebar. You could say, well, this networking thing that sits on my desk that says AT&T or Spectrum or Comcast on it, is that a computer? Well, if it has a processor in it, and it has memory in it, and it has, some gazinnas and gazoudas, then it's a computer. The user interface is optional. I don't share a lot of pictures or images in this class because I really entrust this to the power of words. But as I've displayed like a picture of the pizza box, this 19-inch rack-mounted piece of equipment that sits in a windowless room. It's a computer. It lacks a direct user interface, but every one of these things has some sort of remote user interface to that. That's going to be basis for our little assignment for Module 3 anyway. A little bit of that. So the subject for Chapter 9 is really all of these virtual, augmented, mixed reality sorts of things. My new home department abbreviates that as XR for X the unknown. Focus here is primarily virtual reality, and that's certainly subsumes games, but it's not exclusively about games. And augmented reality, again, that's a point for a later slide. So you would benefit right now by clicking on the link that takes you to the Microsoft HoloLens webpage. And so you can see the HoloLens. You can see like a person wearing the HoloLens hood, goggles, and that, my understanding is that there are, the user in this case is seeing a synthetic display in 2D or 3D that is being projected binocularly onto an internal display that the user can see. There's also cameras inside the goggles that look at where the eyes are directed, perhaps where they're directed and focused, that we will refer to as gaze tracking. So note also that there are what are called accelerometers. There are position and motion sensors also in these goggles. So if you turn your head to the right and look up, obviously that's enough of information for the software system to understand where you are looking. And that would be fed back to the user by by realigning the posture to, in this, turn to the right, to a display that is consistent with having turned to the right. So we've got these accelerometers in 3 dimensions that give us velocity and acceleration and position. There's a point a little bit later on haptic response. That's not in the HoloLens, but a tactile feeling. I'm going to refer to the movie Ready Player One again, and or the book. For the haptic suits, I have no examples to display of that, though. So the context for this is greater than games, but it certainly includes the games. It includes all sorts of wearables of all kinds. They don't necessarily have to be these virtual reality hoods to go with. And let me make mention as we wrap up on slide number 2, for the virtual reality headset in a lot of different venues is like a cheap way of doing training, a cheap way of doing impactful quality training and education. We are aware in many situations in in defense and public safety, where the training is taking place with the goggles rather than being in a physical place. Also aware in medical education, where the consumables may be cadavers that and which are not plenty, and so our ability to provide basic and continuing medical and health-related education may be delivered through this kind of situation. Also gives you the ability to scale, and that obviously, if I were to be doing a heart surgery, standing with my hands in the workpiece, I would describe that as at scale. But I could also, perhaps in the same kind of setting, explore the heart as something that was, the size of a pencil eraser. And so the virtual reality simulation can adapt scale to be large or small, or something your imagination probably is sufficient to take us there. Virtual reality entertainment and gaming might then involve some cooperative task involving other humans and machines in real time, and so we got that going on. And we can expect more of that. Certainly, why pay living actors and actresses, etc.? Why build, fake submarines and stuff when we can synthesize all of these sorts of things, and perhaps even continue casting people after their demise? Okay, so I'm not the entertainment person. Don't have, I get these entertainment factoids indirectly from other people. Certainly enjoy a good story more than most. Point number 3 under the use cases is AR for augmented reality, and that this modifies the wearable to be transparent, and so you're driving, you're flying, you're doing a machine inspection or part inspection or something like that, and you have some sort of display device, whether it's on the inside of a cockpit or a windshield, or on glasses, or perhaps imprinted on a contact lens, that you're having information supplied to you in your field of view while your hands are busy and your eyes are on task. And so there is also, some traction in the augmented reality space, and the training education part of VR is practical, and the entertainment and gaming thing is speculative, and my indications are that is growing. I'm not authoritative in that. Slide number 3. Jumble of concepts here that we'll just kind of go through quickly. They're not necessarily related by anything other than they're all together on slide number 3. So one of the principles that Mr. Kelly shared with us is that it is you'll indicate the improvement of virtual reality and augmented reality as the presence attributes improve and the interactivity improves, such that in the goggles themselves, there's a response to head movement and eye movement and grossly body movement, but not without haptic kind of gloves. There's no response relative to the motions of hands, etc. Then the trends would be for more senses. Where's that going to go? I'm not sure we can calibrate the sense of smell, but the sense of touch, I don't know how you calibrate the sense of taste, smell, etc. Don't know how they're going to do that, but obviously some bright people are working on that. More intimacy, more immersion, more detail. Apparently there's a market for, I don't want to call it B-roll or stock images, but the accumulated experiences, let's say, in the context of like an IMAX movie, if someone were to collect three-dimensional image data from, let's say, while painting the Golden Gate Bridge, then that basic background material could be retained in some format such that some later, immersive experience or game or movie or something could could reuse or remix, as they said before, some of these things that will accumulate. Again, I'm not a participant in this, not authoritative in this, but I'm trying to interpret accurately what the book said. Metcalfe's law says the power of the network is, n the number of participants, n squared. So collective community shared experiences in real time, could be quite a lever or amplifier or multiplier, to this. Just add those words, please, to your vocabulary. Couple closing remarks on slide number 3. A paradox is something that is both true and not true at the same time. It's something that embraces some sort of internal contradiction. Well, the virtual reality is, by name, a contradiction. It's both the simulation, which is the virtual aspect, which is the realness. Well, excuse me, the reality is the realness, and the virtuality simulated part is the unrealness. And so the quality of experience, as it were, will increase with the perhaps the detailed accuracy of at least the visual aspects, which is what we can accomplish today with 3D image capture, and then as other touchable haptic activities go forward, we'll have that. Why ride the newest roller coaster at Kings Island at Cedar Point when you can be in some sort of physical environment which will give you the same physical bodily jerking and acceleration and dropping and whatever else that comes with our roller coaster rides. Finally, final point, body as password. That's going to come up a couple times in the book. It may well be that our fingerprint is uniquely us. Our retinal scan is uniquely us. It may be that there's our DNA is uniquely us. Well, that's true, but that has to be matched against a stored version of the same thing. I'm not so much worried about someone making some sort of like latex cast of my thumbprint. That's kind of movie type stuff. But it's like the copy that's in the system cannot necessarily be secured. There's no implicit security short of proof that the thumbprint that I'm matching up against is me. If they've got the electronic image of my thumbprint, they're matching it against me, but can they keep their representation of my thumbprint safe and secure? Not proven. On to slide number 4, which is tracking. Take a deep breath. We can just pivot from one chapter to the next, from one idea to the next, without exhaling. All right. So chapter 10 is entitled Tracking. It's really about the Internet of Things. And so there's really not a verb that goes with the Internet of Things. I have spent my entire working career, doing systems development, including systems that would fit on one chip and sit, in a box that might have like 2 buttons and a couple, different colored lights on them that perform some industrial function or what have you. And so it's like we've been putting electronics on things forever. My initial company had to do with the scanning of barcodes. Used to be a point of sale transaction involved either neglecting the inventory nature of a sale or having somebody forced to key in the stock keeping number or SKU or part number, as that thing took place. So it's like we've been doing this stuff for decades. So to some extent, it's not new. And given Moore's Law, that same chip that cost $30, 30 years ago, costs 30 cents today. And so that is an invitation for us to put a program on that chip to go do something. And sometimes our ambitions exceed our ability to do things well. That's not the point. The Internet of Things, I don't know, our leading network company, whose name is Cisco, like San Francisco, puts this well into the tens of billions. Say it's the $50 billion guess, given that our population is 8. It would assume that, of course, some of us might have 100 different Internet-enabled kind of devices, but these are huge numbers. These are not synonyms, these are related words. So, in the sense that computers have processors, memory, and interfacing, we have embedded or embeddable devices that have, some sort of sensory input, some sort of processing or interpreting or filtering or cleanup of the data, and some sort of program that might say, send it off to someplace else or change the units of measure or something like that. So we have sensors and trackers. It's very rare in the discussion of Internet of Things that we just talk about labels, in that clothing, garments often have embedded radio frequency, not radioactive, active on the radio kind of tagging in these things, but sensors measure all sorts of things. Now, the implication, though, is that we have all these sensor-enabled, sensor-embedded devices, and that the activity will be tracked and transmitted someplace where, my definition is that it will be archived and perhaps analyzed. Might be analyzed by itself individually, or it might be analyzed in a group as of collected. One of my colleagues, I believe, was doing smart containers for meds. That might have been part of the labeling. The adhesive label that goes on the container might have been the containers themselves. I don't exactly recall. I've also kind of seen a use case where consider foods that date expire, or foods that for which the sell-by date is indicative of the safe consumption of that product, and the label is perhaps attached to some meat item or dairy item or other kind of item that you would measure its safety for consumption, and that would be reflected in some status that is displayed on the label. So you go to the refrigerator, the refrigerated section of the grocery store, and you pick up an item, and the label is red. It says, "Don't buy me. I'm not, I'm beyond safe to eat," for either reasons of inspection or reasons of measurement or reasons by date. That's kind of where we're going, and it may also be that for some high-value products, I'm even now thinking of ingestible capsules, that they maintain an interior, they maintain a embedded serial number, and as these items passively go through manufacture and then dispensing, ingesting, circulating through the systems of your body, and then excretion, and then collection. What happy thoughts? That all kind of fits into this Internet of Things scheme, where presumably we're collecting data at all these different points in time, points in space, and maybe we're doing something with the data after them or not. So as an aside, not in book, who owns this data and controls its privacy? The U.S. standard is the entity that collects the data owns the data. I think the European standard is such that the individual owns the data, has the right to edit and purge the data. That's not the U.S. perspective. California is trying to do something a little differently, and that's law, but subject to repeal. So, the book then on slide 4, kind of talks about really two genres of data. One is like specifically, data collected in the wild, that's kind of telemetry type, focusing on human health, or, health of living organisms. And the second, kind of the curation of digital creations, that are both, our emails, our documents, and our electronic footprint through the transactions of the stuff we buy, etc. So on to slide number 5. These Fitbit and activity trackers are like really popular. I've not been one of those participants, but a lot of people around me are counting their steps, which is interesting. The health efficacy has not been like clinically proven, but we don't improve what we don't measure, and so on an individual basis, perhaps the benefits are more subtle than that. As a longer aside, year over year we have more and more computerization of our business processes, yet it's never been proven that that has been made systematically in the kind of studies that academics do. Never exactly shown that it's been of any great benefit. In fact, it's been studied and proven not to display any kind of innate, obvious, visible overall long-term benefit. But there's rational decisions in adoption of a lot of the technologies, and the benefits are competitive and they're relative, and they're obviously the firms that survive can point to this as a signal of their success. So just to make a long story short, the benefits of these things are not necessarily provable in a general sense. The monetization, the $100 billion that Google makes a year off ads, that is very specific, that is very real. But the benefits of the Fitbit, I believe, are nuanced and informal. The latest Fitbit attribute wants to deal with 100 plus metrics. They discuss, and then this is a legitimate statement, the individualized therapeutics. I will get this wrong, but we now speak not so much about, we speak about chronic and acute pain, but we also speak knowledgeably these days about what's called P4 medicine, which is personal, preventative, and 2 other Ps. Predictive, and these are the things all to prevent ill health, and so the individualized therapeutics that they claim in this Fitbit, in this emerging Fitbit suite, fits well with tobacco cessation, with weight loss, and diabetes and hypertension. These trackers, I'm not sure which ones, will know what time it is and no GPS. Our time of day comes off the GPS system anyway, and so that's fine. The latest of the latest is that these data are integrated with electronic health records and electronic medical records. Arguably, some insurers may discount those who choose to share this kind of data. It could be their activity, could be a broader suite of self-reporting, what you're eating, how you're spending your time. That's the future of medicine. We'll just say that it's an experiment now, and in some settings it may be like a large-scale experiment. I don't have visibility. I think it's very interesting stuff. Except for the final point is that the state of the art in these activity trackers. The one thing it really needs to do, the one thing they really need to do but can't do, is draw blood and do the serum kind of analysis of blood. I believe the blood oxygen can be monitored. Things like pulse and blood pressure can be monitored through the device. But there are still people that have to, take a blood sample on a regular basis to test their blood sugar. And if we look at people in at-risk situations where advice would be most actionable, we don't have a solution to that. So we have a solution to keep healthy people healthy. We don't have a solution to provide medical interventions based on the state of our art today. And I'm sure our most thoughtful people in the universe are working on this problem because we don't want to grow old. Slide number 6. to wrap up. New idea, new word. One of my favorites is trade space. A trade-off analysis implies that you can have one or the other, but not both in full. And that another word for that is zero sum. A zero sum game is that there's one winner and one loser. And okay, maybe there's the potential for a tie, but the benefit universe is limited, the benefit pool is limited, the sum of the gains and the losses adds up to zero, hence the notion of the zero-sum game, and the idea about trade-offs in rivals. You could spend your time to go to the football game, or you could spend your time home studying. You can go out and exercise and go out and eat. You can take a nap, either or. You get that hour once, and so, we sometimes make decisions based on our best interest. Sometimes we make our decisions passively and just kind of stick with habit. But a trade space is the way we would use words to describe our choice between alternatives. And this trade space is, the first time he uses it, this is fairly complex, but I speak so long about this because it really describes the book. Because you can either have something that's personal and open to Google and Amazon and Facebook. You want something really personalized. If you want your internet interaction to be very personalized, then you gotta be willing to share all your stuff with a partner, and shall we say, all of their partners. Versus if you want to basically operate solo, keep your information private, and have all your interactions to be generic. Better targeted ads. If you want better targeted ads, you have to permit Google to maintain a dossier on you and keep track of your searches, and to keep track of your purchases, and keep track of your locations. And if you're a Gmail user, kind of the most popular terms that appear in your Google Docs, in your Gmails, and even on your calendar. And at the other extreme, you have people like me who don't use their products and that clear the histories out of all browsers and are very circumspect about that. That's not paranoid. That's being secure. I'm a private person. I think the trade space analysis is excellent because in his case he makes it continuous, what I will call a continuum, noting that it's not exactly either or, that you can have this little slider thing that you can slide between one or the other, that you could say that you will you don't necessarily have a choice, that your healthcare providers and your insurance company share a lot of stuff, and they probably share it back at some level with your employer, and you probably can't avoid that. You can avoid your location tracking. You can avoid your retail history tracking. You can choose. If you want the privilege of navigation, then you have to let the phone know where you are. If you want the Find My Phone function to be provided by your phone provider, you got to let your phone company kind of check your location every 15 minutes, whether you're using it or not. And I hate to say this, but a lot of people who depend on the state for public assistance, for public benefits, to get through those rough times, which certainly has included my family, the level of surveillance and scrutiny over people that accept public benefits is dramatically higher. And finally, the people that pay cash, the cash still is non-traceable versus the credit card related sorts of things. We all love to have the convenience of, credit cards and debit cards. There are obviously the vulnerabilities innate with that, not even to mention, the Apple Pay, Google Pay kind of environment. But obviously that comes at the expense of privacy. So, and then the final happy point on which to wrap up an overly long lecture is that I came out of a real applied math department. my discipline at The Ohio State University, major field operations research in a department now known curiously as Integrated Systems Engineering. Pretty much says that we don't need a lot of data in order to give good advice. That we can, from a little bit of data and an understanding of the variation of the data, can tell what the problem is. And data sampling is sufficient. The example I will use in class, full disclosure, I drive an Ohio-built Honda Accord. It's nearing 300,000 miles. Right now it's an experiment to see how far I can drive it before the wheels fall off. And it looks great and it's clean. But they don't inspect all parts of every car. I mean, it's just an incredible vehicle. They inspect just enough parts to make sure that the process that made those parts is within the bounds it needs to be, statistically speaking. So the reason why they can sell a great car for cheap and it lasts forever is that the parts are quality parts, and they aren't quality because somebody inspected the quality into the parts. It's because they understood the underlying statistics that made them and what the sources of variation were on each of those. That's a mouthful, but the long and short of it is we don't need big data. We just need to know what causes the problems, and we don't really start inspecting closely until there's a deficiency. I take the same approach in this class, and that 80% of the students will not need an intervention. Some will, and the depth of that intervention will be based on the level of their noncompliance. We have just wonderful results in this class. It's not because of me. I think it's because we have adult students who work hard and want to get the degree done. And I want you to get the degree done and learn this stuff and have a good grade and have some good stories to tell to your friends. So proper data collection, the scientific method is observe, generalize, theorize, test. Well, you observe data, come up with a theory of the data, and then you run some experiments to see, how the theory works, and then you're good. And when we look at signals and electrical engineering, there's like a signal part, and there's always like a little bit of noise. There's always stuff going on in the background, and it doesn't matter. We filter out the noise. That was not part of the filtering chapter, but there's stuff that's not relevant to that. And so if you've ever listened to like the old kind of radio, like AM radio, we just got an entire huge number of different kinds of noise. You hear every thunderstorm, you hear every fluorescent light, you hear all these things to the point that it annoyed so much people you don't listen to it anymore. You have LPs and vinyl discs, and even tube-type guitar amplifiers. Well, if it's not part of the music, it's part of the noise. And same thing here. I mean, if it's not the part of the data that tells a story, we can safely and professionally, with integrity, ignore it. So the signal-to-noise ratio is something we talk about a lot. Part of making the electronics work in this stuff, part of why a digital phone call, when it really works well, is just wonderful. Part of why CDs and DVDs are better than VHS tape and analog phones. So, the best performance is the result of intentional analysis and modest data collection. That could be your master's degree. I'll write you a letter of recommendation. There's a place for the numeracy, but it never, ever, ever depends on collecting 100% of the data, 100% of the time. That's a surveillance sort of thing, and it's like you don't build Hondas out of product surveillance. You build it out of smartness and relationships. End of Unit 5. One more to go. It's Unit 6 of Module 3. It's the end. It's the final recording of Module 3 on the Kevin Kelly book, The Inevitable. We cover a couple chapters, and really, it's how we wrap up the book. I appreciate that you've tolerated an applied book in a technical class. Obviously, we could have mechanically gone through layers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5, 2, 3, 4, 1, gone through the protocol stack and every sketch and every drawing in the Bonaventure book. but I thought it would be more interesting in your future roles in society to be able to apply this, to be able to demonstrate to me, your instructor, that you could think with discernment and analyze and extend the ideas that the author has presented. In my constant engagement with industry and public and private sector leaders, what they really want is critical thinkers and good communicators. What they would really like would be leaders to go with. But, that's a separate story. But if you can distill data, if you can think deductively, if you can communicate, if you can read, write, speak, listen, if you can tell what is high value and low value, if you can distill large amounts of data, even in a small amount of time, then there's a special role for you, in your career, and I want to encourage that. So that's why we do these books. It happens that I read a lot. My Kindle Daily has got something on it, certainly my Cleveland Plain Dealer, my Columbus Dispatch, and probably, a book or something else that I've either purchased or downloaded from the library. I get some downtime, and I try to make it useful. So we reach chapter 11 and 12, and there are some profound points in this, so we don't want to just gloss over this and rush to the end. You, of course, know that test questions come from the slides, not directly from the book. Doesn't mean you have to agree with me, but it does mean that my perspective, my organization, my framework for the book is the only way I could possibly be grading results. I've also mentioned that, you read something related, that doesn't necessarily have to be one of the books I've recommended. There's like plus 5 points, to your point score, extra 5 points on a 100-point scale. If you can articulate that you're going above, it would help to know that sooner rather than finding out in December whether you wanted to do this. But this is pretty rich stuff. It's a virtuous cycle of knowledge where the knowledge accumulates and compounds and we don't necessarily have to read things that we agree with. Sometimes we're stronger by making mistakes. We're stronger by, encountering things that we dislike. And I want to encourage that. This is what employers want. Critical thinkers, good communicators. Most of the time it's deductive. It's distilling a bunch of stuff to a short amount of actionable recommendations and policy changes and stuff. Occasionally it's inductive. Sometimes we look at all this and say, well, I could do better. Let me invent something. Let me solve a problem. Let me invent something. Exercise those both parts of your character and personality. Slide number 2, questioning. I've got some what I will call use cases. We will go through the use cases. He interestingly refers to whatever this is as the screen of all knowledge. Okay, maybe it's your computer, maybe it's your phone, maybe it's your tablet. It's the screen of all knowledge. The all part is pretty frightening. We should not dismiss the fact that all of everything ever created can be digitized and stored and put in the cloud someplace where we can flow to it in all or parts, share it and annotate it. We can experience it. If we customize it and tweak it, if we're the purveyor of it, we can extract a whole lot more value if we've personalized it, because, individuation and personalization seems to be worth more than the commodity stuff. And you've been forewarned that everything in tech is a commodity. What I call a race to the bottom is the marginal unit cost of production, dissemination, distribution drops every year, year over year. Thank you, Gordon Moore and Moore's Law. And it's more fun with friends. Collectively, that's Metcalfe's Law. And there is no Hoag's Law, other than get your work done on time. Get it done before December 13th. So this chapter, The Screen of All Knowledge, working backwards, trillions of questions asked per year, questions you wouldn't dare ask a human. You ask Google, and Google knows, unless you have gone in and expressly told Google to forget. And I don't trust its forget feature. All right. They make 27 cents per search based on the ads that accompany the search results and the ordering of the search results. I want to know why, if I'm sitting in Athens at OU and I accidentally put Ohio University in the search box, that I get other universities. I get Walden U, I get WGU, I get Southern New Hampshire, I get everybody else but OU, and I'm sitting right there on campus. I want to know that. And that's thousands or tens of thousands more frequent than questions that we would ask of a reference librarian. The value of the search results are monetized. That's $30 a month, kind of. So depending on the rate at which we ask it questions and the benefit of those questions or the amount of time that we have displaced by looking something up, is worth a couple bucks. My source is Mr. Kelly and his research. And of course, we mentioned before that 27 cents per search adds up pretty quickly. Or I don't know how quickly, but it certainly adds up to $100 billion a year of profit, and their expenses are none, basically. And it doesn't take much to run a company like that. The author chooses to sidestep the negative consequences, or what economists call the negative externalities of this, and it is not all good. Some of it is neutral. Some of it is worse than neutral. The neutral part first, I didn't really list this, but at some point somebody said, can we localize, can we geolocate the incidence of disease using Google based on where the searches come from, where and when? The short answer is no. So if people are, saying, I want to look up flaky skin, or something, or my eye is red, we cannot use search to find, the spread of Ebola, which was something we pursued in Ohio a couple years back. Just doesn't work. But the instructors' book selections back on slide 1 identify a couple perils that you might investigate. And of course, the industry's in the wealth and income business, so the industry kind of denies these things. That doesn't mean anything. There's nothing to be gleaned from the denials. But the research behind Jean Twenge's thing on iGen, which is kind of a FOMO, fear of moving out, social media sorts of things, it was the first of a growing genre of people, of qualified data-driven researchers, who are probably college, university professor types, showing that the more we use some of this stuff, the less well we feel about ourselves. I'm the father of daughters, and so, I find this a little bit applicable. I find this very applicable. Would like to see Professor Twenge, who actually, I think she did her PhD up at Case, so she spent some time in Cleveland, happily. The other book I would put on this list is Irresistible, which is, again, a little bit more male. The relationship of game use, dare I say game addiction, is an interesting thing. And both of the Twenge and Adam Alter things you can equivalently find book talks and interviews and YouTube kind of video explications. You could spend a couple minutes to see if you would like the conversation, and then you go read the book. If you read the book, you can probably get 3 credit hours out of the independent study system of e-learning, and maybe write a little paper to go with, emphasis on little. And then the other bullet point is literature on the content and ad manipulation of elections globally is emerging like daily. And this is not a political statement, because we don't do that in my classes. But the desire to disrupt Western democracies is kind of a known, proven fact perception of certain nation states. And, they weren't like overly technical kind of attacks. They just bought a bunch of ads and tried to manipulate certain segments of the public and get them out to vote. Because it's obviously the voting thing is not about changing people's minds. It's about the minds of which people you actually want to get to show up to vote. that could tell people of one mind to kind of stay home or others to get out and vote. And the ability to segment that market and target those people and influence them is proven. And at this point, as I record this, there is been tacit admission by primarily Facebook that they got kind of that this happened to them, and they're reluctant to make the kind of changes that would prevent that from continuing. Obviously, there's been no significant government intervention to make them change their ways, and the presidential election is in 2020. Not a political statement. Again, it's just really like hot current events. And again, be a cool 3-hour independent study for somebody. On to slide number 3, the use cases. Couple quotes, or at least some quoted expressions in this. This is very personal from the author. This is like really personal from the author. So let's just attribute all of this to Mr. Kelly. It's clear that collectives amplify power. Good statement. The shared experience is rich, whether it's reading a book together or watching a movie together in a theater versus at home, being part of a game, watching other people play games. I have to see where this came from. I think that might be a Herbert Simon quote. Simon was a Nobel Prize winning kind of person from, I believe, Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh, kind of like Metcalf and Moore, but the collective's amplifying power is pretty huge. This is kind of Hollywoodish, technium, word I hadn't heard before, is our modern system of systems and technology. How would exactly we characterize this somewhat democratization of contributions and consumption of internet-based content? Don't know. With scale, interesting point, since we have like infinite compute and infinite networking and infinite storage, stuff that used to be impossible or at least highly likely is going to happen. And that's a different perspective on the inevitable, but or at least a different rephrasing of it. It's not like the statement that we can argue for or against, but, things that might have modest demand that might only have 5 people, in the world interested in, it's enough for a website. It's enough for a book. It's enough for 5 people to buy the same book out in this, what I've depicted as the long tail of the Amazon fulfillment chain. It's like, maybe rare, but in the everything store, you can buy a copy. And then interesting, another Kelly personal statement that, he's kind of less respective of authority, less certain about things. He mentioned before kind of the what is truth part. Is truth something that, was given to us externally? Is truth something that we vote on? I think in his case, he I think it's a proper word. He's confused. That the things that had been certain in an era of scarcity, with lots of silent voices, are a little less clear when everybody's chatting about it at once. Wikipedia, okay, and I'm going to say Wikipedia has a place. Wikipedia, often has so many hands in it that it's never. That there's so many eyeballs watching the Wikipedia entry for, Youngstown, the city, that so many people are kind of watching that theoretically you're never more than a day away from having somebody fixing any mistake or any mischief or abuse or vandalism on it. So that's interesting. I don't really much care for Wikipedia. It does show up in search results. Especially, on the search system that I use through my phone. I'll look at the footnotes. I don't use Wikipedia content ever. I discourage that. But, if something has few footnotes or the footnotes are old, I'm going to figure that the article is stale and need to keep looking around. I'm a practiced academic, so these kind of paid databases I turn to first. To be quite honest, I've got publishers and publications that I trust. I've got organizations and publications that I trust. And if it comes from there, I've been at this for a little while, I go with them, as opposed to what the Wikipedia entry says. And there are some tells with Wikipedia that the content is going to be at best stale, at worst biased. Won't get into deeply, but it's like knowledge and information are different ideas. Information and data are different ideas, and they are not synonyms of each other. What I will say, because I study encryption and I study like low-level digital data communications, the information is the stuff that's left after you wring out all the duplicates and strip away the encryption. Okay, and so sometimes we're embellishing, or we're padding, or we're repeating, but it's like by the time you take out the non-uniqueness, what you have left is unique information with a little I, and whether it's knowledge or not, that's kind of up to you. And then he ends with a paradox, which is kind of what journalists and writers can come up with, that, is novelists will say, well, every answer creates even more questions. Well, that is the result of an uncertain, confused kind of mind. Personally, I want to reach closure, which means I want to go to chapter 12, and then I want to finish the book, you and me both. Okay? So I'm comfortable with paradox, by the way. Paradox is, duality is a paradox. That we have things that appear to look and work one way, which is sometimes really nice because we're already trained in something very similar. It's very easy to go from a laptop to a desktop if they're both Windows, because, we kind of know how things are going to behave. I don't want to get into other kind of metaphors, but taking advantage of the user frame of reference is wise in terms of interface design. You end up with fewer errors and happier customers and maybe more money. And so duality is completely okay. Paradoxical, takes all the dualities and then adds riddles and adds non-answerable questions to it. And so paradox is its own thing. Wow. Can we finish now, please? On to chapter 12, labeled The Beginning. It's the cycle of life. Well, it's not the beginning, it's the end. It's the end of the book. And when we are going to allow ourselves perspective and reflection. On slide number 5, I have very few words, and I don't want to get into these explanations because I'd like you to listen and appreciate and not really try to define these things. Scale means big. I mean, the only way we deal with scale in this thing is like when we want to take something and then we want to put 1 billion users on it. So, I'm part of the business side of the internet, and I don't need to be wealthy, but I'm completely endorsing of success, especially with my students. And so if you develop a little idea and it turns into a great big company, I'm completely okay with that. There are those people who develop systems for one user or one organization, and that's fine. And there are others that want to take it and then see how far it can go. Period. Points number 2 and 3 kind of go together, and we won't cover these companion ideas of complexity and entropy ever again in the class. And if it interests you, you can send me an email and ask. And I probably have a couple books that also go with that. The Wisdom of Crowds and The Theory That Wouldn't Die, kind of go with this. Well, part of having like infinite resources to do the internet, part of having as many programs as we want, and storing everything, keeping everything that we can, and having not being constrained by how little memory we have on our devices. If we have abundance, then we have kind of the invitation to perhaps be a little bit sloppy and wasteful. If you're not getting the bill, then do you have to like clean your plate and eat all the food on your plate? If you're not getting the bill, should you turn the lights off when you leave? If you're not, if you're not getting a bill for having a program with more and more and more and more features, if there's no penalty function for that, then you permit your system to expand. I learned my development skills in an environment where we practically used a shoehorn to get stuff into the program, into the chip, into the device, which meant that our capacity was limited. We had to be very effective in our user interaction, and we had to be very disciplined. And that's not the culture of our systems today, especially if they're running in the cloud, because the cloud itself, by definition, is elastic. It stretches. We don't really care about how little capability our phone or our devices have. And case in point, typical school implementation in K-12 is Chromebooks. A Chromebook is like a $50 computer that's got really nothing that you can store on it. It's kind of a dumb device when it's not connected to the internet. And I think the iPad tablet paradigm is pretty much the same thing, that it's a nice access device that's compact, but it's really not designed to have a lot of stuff stored on it, my perception of it. And so because we have infinite capacity, we have permitted and we tolerate infinite complexity, and that this complexity is a form of disorder, and the universe, second law of thermodynamics is this principle called entropy that says eventually the unwinding of the universe, apparently, based on increasing complexity, mathematically is predicted. There's no evidence to the contrary, and that if we really, really look in the abstract at the internet, we seem to follow the mathematical predictions of this. So, it happens that our applications program development is the sloppiest, most careless, most error-prone, most non-secure aspect of software development, of anything in the internet. Those folks that put stuff in the chips and then they screw it on the box tend to write the most compact, least error-prone kind of software, and so it's it's an odd, inevitable consequence of having Moore's law run to completion. Moore's law runs to completion means we can keep everything, and we don't have to have the discipline of throwing stuff out or doing a good job with that. Happy entropy. All right, on to slide number 6. Reflection. Well, I'm really just going to summarize this stuff because the reflection is yours. We'll finish a couple moments early, and so you can, in fact, pause and reflect. What really enabled the inevitable, the declining unit cost of production based on Moore's law? The implementation of stuff in software rather than in hardware. It's massless, weightless, it's invisible, and so it's unconstrained. And so, we have software tools that increasingly are free. No reason for somebody can't learn to write programs anywhere in the world at any age, at any time, because all the tools are either free or cheap. That's an enabler. And ultimately, this business of taking the high functional stuff away from the user's desktop, letting them still manipulate it with the same facility that they had before, but sticking it in the cloud and giving people basically a terminal or entry device into the cloud, that's kind of a big enabler. That's why we have these, billion-dollar data centers popping up here and there, and the computers themselves, basically, what did I say? The Chromebook's $100. A cheap Android phone is maybe $50. So merely for me to generalize in 3 points or less, the trends across the inevitable, across these, well, the prior 11 chapters to go with this stuff. Shoot, let's throw in scale and complexity. The trends across the inevitable, from my perspective, only to keep it to 3 points, is we want novelty. We want something new and cool and interesting. Maybe we get bored. So we have an appetite for this sort of thing. Point number 2 under this, there is a legitimate drive for wealth creation that may not be apparent to the traditional students among us. But, wealth is separate from income, because wealth is something you can keep and give away. Income is kind of transient and taxed. All right. And so wealth and fear are other motivators. You can maybe think of other things that motivate people to do something or do something great. And then the final trend of this, which I think is the coolest of all, and the one that I never personally saw coming, was really the goal to create. And this is where we embrace the artists, the authors, the video, the visual, the image folks, and the people that really want to go off and create new companies to go with. I think it all kind of fits together. If the human nature parts of this are beautiful, and I think that they marry the technology pieces quite so well. And I'll wrap up kind of the unspoken slide 6, as I've said before. I mean, the ultimate duality in this is that, thoughtful people who are not nascently, inherently, genetically technical people have a huge role in the creation of products, the invention, the imagination of systems. And with this great big hammer called duality, can say to the technical community, just go make this now. Let's go make one and see if it works. Thank you for enduring the 6th longest lectures in the history of my e-learning classes. Hope you've benefited from this. Always appreciate your comments. And good luck with the exercise, and wish you well with the module exam. Thank you.